What's up, everyone? How are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was secretly trained by every Kage before becoming a Genin? If you enjoy, then please like, share, and do comments. The 10th of October was a day of varying importance to the citizens of Konohagakure. Depending on who you were, it could go from a day of celebration and near worship of the Yondaime Hokage, the man who was able to, against all odds, defeat the seemingly invincible Kyuubi no Yoko as it nearly razed the village to the ground. Conversely, if you were one of the survivors of the attack or someone who had lost someone to the demon's fury, it was a day of mourning and remembrance. Many people simply tried to move on, though, and would partake in the festival commemorating the defeat of the beast and the sacrifice of their brave ninja. However, none of this applied to one young boy. If you were to just take a glancing look at him as he ran past you on this day, you'd probably think nothing of it. Just another small child out for the festival, running around and enjoying himself. Upon closer inspection, though, you'd begin to notice that a few things were off, to say the least. The first thing that you'd likely notice is that unlike the rest of the children out playing on this day, this child wasn't running around for joy. He wasn't sprinting as fast as his little 4-year-old legs would carry him to play, despite how much it looked like he was about to keel over from exhaustion. If you were able to get a good look at his clothing, a simple gray t-shirt with a red swirl on the front, and some blue shorts, you'd notice that they were stained, tattered, and torn, and judging from the smell, hadn't been washed in a while either. His usually vibrant blonde hair was matted down around his face in many places, and there were splotches of both mud and dried blood in various places. Along either side of the young child's face, there were two distinct markings, which could almost be mistook for whiskers in the right lighting. But the most distinct feature about the boy were his electric blue eyes. Normally so full of life and promise, tonight, as he ran through the streets, they were filled with the most soul-crushing fear a 4-year-old could muster. Why were they filled with this fear? This anguish that no child should ever have to bear? Well, because tonight, while for others was a night of recollection, of hope, of joy, and of sorrow, for this child it was a night of absolute terror for a reason he had no idea. You see, it was known to all of the adults in the village that this child held the very beast that had nearly destroyed their village. Due to a lack of understanding of the obscure art of fuinjutsu, it was mistaken that the boy was the demon fox itself, merely in a human form, instead of the boy containing the demon's raw power. Unfortunately, due to the inability to distinguish between the kana and the scroll it is sealed in, the boy lived in constant fear, neglect, and near isolation, which was only amplified on this day, the anniversary of the attack. Officially, under the Sandaime Hokage's ruling, no person who was under a specific age was allowed to speak of the burden one Uzumaki Naruto carried, with a severe penalty for those who trespassed against it. However, this did nothing to quell the hatred the boy had to deal with. And today, a day which should have seen him as a hero, he was viewed as an object of vengeance for nearly all who had lost so much in the attack 4 years ago. As you can imagine, a 4-year-old can only run so far, can only hide in so many places, and can only take so much before they slip up, and for one so young it doesn't take much. It wasn't long into the night that young Naruto had already vacated his first 3 hideouts, and was on his way to his 4th, before he found himself cut off from his escape, and rooted into a small back alley. As he realized his mistake and subsequent trapping, he spun to try and leave this dead end, only to find his only escape cut off by several of the more drunk and violent villagers. Armed with various weapons, and with all the liquid courage seeping through their veins, they had chased and pursued so child, until they had eventually cornered him. The apparent leader of the group, if you could call him that, advanced on the boy, who by now had backed up as far into the alley as he could, desperately searching for a way out and finding none. With panic in his eyes, Naruto began to desperately plead with them, but it would prove to be to no avail, as the man hefted his makeshift club and brought it down upon the child's arm that he had raised to defend himself, breaking it. Crumpling like a ball, Naruto closed his eyes and waited for the sweet embrace and serenity of unconsciousness, as the beating from the man continued and others moved to join in, intending to finish him off and finally avenge their fallen comrades and family. Luckily or unluckily, if you happened to be a member of the mob beating the young boy, the next blow to strike the child's prone form was deftly caught, and its owner swiftly kicked in the chest and disarmed. All movement stopped as all members of the mob began to realize just who had stopped, in their eyes, their rightful vengeance. The new arrival's large frame slowly and deliberately turned around, and as his white hair parted, the members of the mob could only stand helplessly as they were met with the eyes of a man barely containing unbridled fury. The killing intent radiating from the newcomer was paralyzing, effectively neutralizing the untrained and unfit villagers and rooting them to their spots. One by one, the man glared a hole into everyone's eyes before quickly and violently dropping his killing intent, but continuing to stand in between them and the fallen Naruto. The message was clear, and the mob quickly dispersed, nearly trampling their fallen comrade in the process. No matter how inebriated they may have been, everyone in the village knew who this legend was. After all, there was only one man in the world who wore a headband with the kanji for oil on it, and he was not to be trifled with. Jiraiya sighed to himself and turned back to the matter at hand, namely, the beaten and unconscious child at his feet. Stooping low and cradling the child in his arms, he took to the rooftops, already headed in the direction of the hospital. He had heard throughout his travels of things like this happening to the young Naruto, but had always downplayed it in the back of his mind as exaggeration, for surely the Sandaime wouldn't allow something as cruel as this to happen. Jiraiya had trusted in his old sensei, after the old man had refused the Toad Sage's request to take the boy with him at birth to travel the elemental nations. After tonight, though, witnessing firsthand the dangers and suffering Naruto had to undertake, he made a decision. He was Naruto's godfather, and damn it if he wasn't going to take care of him. Naruto was going to leave this village with him, and he wasn't taking no for an answer. As the hospital came into view and Jiraiya began to slow his approach, he steeled himself for the backlash that he would soon be dealing with. Tomorrow, Jiraiya would be having a chat with the Sandaime, and he didn't think Hiruzen was going to approve of his decision. Hiruzen Sarutobi was a man of routine. Now, normally, as a ninja, and especially as a Hokage or any other ranking person in a world full of assassins, cutthroats, and betrayals, a routine is something that you vehemently try to avoid. When most men fall into a routine, they become a prime target for assassination, as then become predictable and thus easier to track. However, the third Hokage was not most men. A powerful shinobi in his own right, owner of the monikers, the god of shinobi and the professor, and two-time Hokage after the fall of his successor to the hands, or should I say, paws of the Kyuubi no Kitsune, Hiruzen Sarutobi allowed himself to fall into a steady routine. Approaching his twilight years in life, and certainly being one of the oldest in his chosen profession, Sarutobi had fallen into such a routine that helped to ease his old and brittle bones. But that isn't to say that he became any less vigilant. All it meant was that he no longer had the energy or the care enough to constantly change his daily life to become less of a target. So, when he was sitting behind his desk, gazing out over his beloved village at precisely 9:30 in the morning, drinking his tea as he watched the village he so diligently protected and lead come to life, he was understandably quite surprised when one of his wayward students hopped through the window, nearly knocking him over in the process. Composing himself and deftly managing to move out of the way of the large man that had just unceremoniously let himself in during what was quite possibly the only quiet moment of his day, Sarutobi turned around, sighed. Why couldn't he ever learn how to use a door? He idly wondered to himself as Jiraiya dusted himself off and leaned against one of the walls, crossing his arms as he did so. Hiruzen glanced up at his former student, a smile beginning to form on his face, until he made eye contact with the Sannin when his smile faltered. He'd known Jiraiya for many years now, and could tell from the look on his face that this wasn't merely a social call. Taking a final sip of his tea and finishing it, he placed the now empty cup back onto the desk before clearing his throat and addressing his student. Ah, good morning, Jiraiya. I was unaware that you were back in the village. Perhaps the ANBU are getting sloppy. Hiruzen chuckled at himself as Jiraiya merely closed his eyes and let a small grin form on his lips. His sensei always did know how to ease the tension in the room. Please, old man, we both know that none of them could ever find me unless I wanted to be found. I may not have been the stealthiest of the three, but I certainly wasn't the worst one. Jiraiya joked back. So, such an unceremonious visit. Am I correct in assuming that you aren't here to simply update me on the progress of your spy network? If that were the case, you could have let an ANBU deliver the report as you usually do so you could stay in the field. What brings you here? Not that I'm not pleased to see you, of course. At this, the only active member of the Sannin pushed himself off of the adjacent wall and moved himself over to in front of the Hokage's desk. His expression turned from one of mild amusement to a more serious one, a rare sight for the usually jovial sage. Sarutobi. The tone of his voice left no room for discussion, and Hiruzen was instantly on guard. Jirya only ever called him by that in dire circumstances, and it had only happened a few times before, most recently, when they had discovered Orochimaru's treachery, and before that, when Jirya had attempted to talk Hiruzen into him raising Naruto. I've made a decision involving Naruto, and I doubt you'll like it. I'm letting you know this out of courtesy, and because you'll no doubt have to inform the council of it, and I don't think they will approve of my decision either. The aging Hokage's brow furrowed, and he momentarily contemplated brewing some more tea. Kami, not even 10 in the morning, my students never would let these old bones rest, I suppose, he thought to himself before turning back to the matter at hand. Jirya, I'm very well aware of your stance on the matter and where you think the child belongs, but the council convened and there's nothing I can do on the matter. Naruto has to remain in the village. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes as he saw Jirya slightly tense his jaw, and he would continue to do so as the man began to speak, enlightening him to what happened the night prior and how the situation had been handled. Jirya, I am aware of the problems the boy faces. I have done everything in my power to keep it from happening, however. I cannot be everywhere at once, and I cannot order my ninja to have a 24-hour guard on him when it comes with the cost of attacking civilians. Now if W. Jirya cut him off with a dismissal wave of his hand before speaking himself. I'm aware of it. For the past 4 years you've sat by and done next to nothing for Naruto. He's been routinely beaten, malnourished, and abused both emotionally and physically. If I hadn't been there last night, who know what might have happened. I've made my decision, Sarutobi village be damned. I refuse to allow Minato's legacy, my godson, to be treated this way. I'm taking him with me, old man. I have to do this. When Jirya finished, his voice was soft but no less sound. He locked eyes with the Sandaime, and neither were wavering in their contact. You can't stop me this time, Sarutobi. To say that Hiruzen was angry was an understatement. The man was known for his sound mind and sounder judgment. However, one thing that was a surefire way to irritate him to no end was to blatantly disrespect him, and then in the same sentence disregard his orders, both of which just happened, and from a man he already gave a large amount of leeway to. Now, at this point in his life, Sarutobi Hiruzen was a considerably short man, but that isn't to say that he didn't cast a particularly long shadow, so to speak. He was, after all, the Hokage for a reason. Remaining sitting, Hiruzen did not glare at his former student, but he did make the most intense eye contact he could muster with the Toad Sage, causing the man to harden his own gaze in return. We have had this talk before, Jirya. I have made myself abundantly clear that Naruto will remain in the village. You will not be taking him with you, or have you forgotten your place? The Hokage spoke with no venom in his voice, only the authority of his position. Jirya at this point at least had the decency to look slightly befuddled. Not at the Hokage's declaration, no, they'd had that talk before, but at the seriousness and power in his voice. It had been many years since he had seen the Sandaime talk with the authority of his position, since the man usually chose to be a soft-spoken mentor in his later years. That was fine, though. The Toad Sage was a master orator himself, and even if this went sideways, which he was relatively sure it might, he had planned a contingency anyways. It's a good thing you're sitting down then, because you're not going to like this. Jirya paused before steeling himself. These next few minutes were rather critical, and they were almost certain to be unpleasant. Hiruzen, I've already taken him out of the village. Naruto will be living with me now. I plan on training him in all. Jirya was unable to finish as the Sandaime took that moment to stand up, locking eyes with the Toad Sage, and made his presence known, speaking with a voice that made it very clear who ran the village hidden in the leaves, a voice that would have cowed all but the most experienced ninja into instant submission. He was going to remind his wayward student who was in charge. Jirya, to his credit, only slightly winced. There was something to be said about angering a peaceful man, after all. Shinji Arasaka was a diligent and smart man. Through hard work and dedication, he had become a Chunin, and then at a later date had been assigned as one of the mission dispatchers. It was while he was bringing up his daily reports to the Hokage for approval that he stopped outside the oak door leading to the Hokage's office. As Shinji's hand went to knock on the door, he could clearly hear the Hokage reprimanding somebody, and that person attempting to justify their position. The sheer hostile intent radiating from the room was suffocating, and Shinji's hand slowly fell to his side. Looking through the reports he was supposed to bring up, he aptly decided none were actually of significant importance, and swiftly turned on his heel back to his own desk. Shinji Arasaka was, after all, a smart and diligent man. Several hours later, north of Konoha, a small forest toad looked around its surroundings before opening its mouth wide as a large human arm jutted out of it. Soon followed a head, shoulders, and eventually the entire broad frame of Jiraiya, cradling in his arms a still asleep Naruto. Looking down and smiling at his godson, Jiraiya couldn't help but he slightly troubled. Not too long ago, the cage bunchen he had left in Konoha to talk to the Sandaime had dispelled, giving the original Jiraiya all the memories it had obtained. To say the least, the Sandaime was less than pleased about the outcome of the situation, but had soon calmed himself once it was revealed that Jiraiya had already left the village with the young Jinchuriki. Jiraiya, while maybe not the best with strategy, had always had natural talent for tactics. So when he had decided to take Naruto with him on his travels, he had promptly made several cage bunchen and set them all out in different directions, all with a hinged Naruto in their arms. Then, the original had summoned a small transport toad and climbed inside with his new charge, and made way to the north towards the land of iron, which had been his next stop after Konoha anyways. Smiling to himself, he began tree-hopping at a leisurely pace, knowing he was already far beyond Konoha's borders and far enough that any pursuit of him would be quite some time off. As he moved along towards Iron Country, he couldn't be more pleased with himself that his escape went so well. That isn't to say that he didn't feel bad, though. Was he remorseful for what he had done? Not in the slightest. He was more than happy and twice as able to protect, raise, and train Naruto as nearly anyone in the village. Jiraiya was, however, upset that he had put his sensei in such a tight spot, so to speak. The Sandaime was probably on his way right now to the council chambers to inform them of what had transpired over the past few hours. Suffice to say, the Toad Sage was upset that he had to force his teacher and friend into that situation, but there was little to be done for it. He looked down at his new charge and smiled once again. At least he now had some company, and he was sure Naruto would be happy to be able to start finding his own place in the world, and the attention he would get from the Sannin could only be a positive thing. Jiraiya continued his journey, already making a mental checklist of the things he would need to purchase in the next town he passed through. All rations would need to double, as would clothing and various other items and amenities, but that shouldn't be a problem. Knowing how to make storage seals greatly assisted with traveling, and being an accomplished author had made the man quite rich, so he wasn't particularly worried. All in all, Jiraiya was pleased with the decision, and he could honestly say he was looking forward to the next 6 years he would spend with his godson, before he had to return him to Konoha. He slightly frowned at that, but some concessions had to be made to avoid having the whole of Konoha's hunter-nin force come searching for himself and Naruto. Once the Sandaime had calmed himself, he and clone Jiraiya had begun discussing what would happen, and if when Naruto would return to the village. Sarutobi had been adamant that Naruto eventually returned to be a ninja of the village. Reluctantly, Jiraiya had agreed. The boy would need to be able to bond and interact with people his own age, and especially with the citizens of the village. So, the Sandaime and the Toad Sage had eventually come to an agreement. Naruto would spend the next 6 years with Jiraiya, and upon his 10th birthday, he would return to the village hidden in the leaves and enroll in the academy, where he would learn to interact with people his own age. Jiraiya knew that the council would be less than pleased about the agreement, but the last active member of the Sannin was quite elusive when he wanted to be, and if he decided to go dark, there was little the council could do about it. Jiraiya looked down once again at the 4-year-old in his arms as it snuggled into his broad chest, attempting to be just a little bit more comfortable as the large man jumped through the trees, and smiled. Yeah, this wouldn't be so bad after all. 2 figures walked leisurely down the well-beaten path, moving along in a comfortable silence, but by no means attempting to be stealthy. The smaller of the two looked up, taking in the massive walls that signified the outermost border of Konohagakure no Sato. The young man raised his left arm up to his head, brushing the moderately long, dull blonde hair out of his eyes, raising one of his eyebrows objectively as he did so. The much larger and older man glanced down at his charge and couldn't help but break out into a grin. Naruto was attempting to hide it, but the now revealed Toad Sage could easily tell that he was apprehensive about his return, to say the least. In truth, Jiraiya's reading of the young Uzumaki wasn't far off from the truth. Over the past 6 years, Naruto had grown by leaps and bounds, and was far from the little defenseless child he had been when Jiraiya had taken him from Konoha. This isn't to say, though, that he wasn't going to be very cautious upon his now short-off return. The atrocities that had been committed against him were still very fresh in the 10-year-old's mind, and he wasn't likely to forget them anytime soon. You know, I highly doubt anyone will recognize you, Naruto. You'll be a fresh, new face as far as most of the citizens are concerned. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if anyone who still wished you harm were few and far between. The old toad sage contemplated, stroking his chin in forethought. Although the old man was quite insufferable at times, there were also many where Jiraiya was more than happy to offer his worldly experience to his young charge, a trait which Naruto had quickly come to appreciate. Plus, kid, I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up being quite the stud. Broad-shouldered man laughed heartily at this, throwing his head back and closing his eyes at his godson's flustered reaction. The youth in question could only shake his head sheepishly as he walked along the path, continuously gaining ground on the ever-approaching gates. Naruto had changed a large amount in the 6 years he had been gone. On a purely superficial level, the boy had grown into a respectable 4'10", and had changed his attire from the old rags and barely fitting clothes he used to wear. After Jiraiya had insisted upon him changing his wardrobe to look more like a ninja, and the subsequent battle over the color orange, and how it had no place on his being, Naruto had relented and allowed the Toad Sage to get him outfitted. Currently, the young Uzumaki was dressed in a pair of loose-fitting black shinobi trousers which were bound down at the ankles with bandages, connecting into a pair of standard black shinobi combat sandals. The Bond was wearing a form-fitting dark green sleeveless shirt, which managed to show off his decently toned and muscled arms quite well. His hands were encased in a pair of black fingerless gloves, and currently both of the dull blonde's arms were resting at a comfortable angle of the long, black sheath of the katana he was resting across his shoulders. Upon closer inspection, it could be revealed that the sword was not a standardized blade that anyone could pick up at any one of the various weapons shops scattered throughout the elemental nations. This blade was truly one of a kind, and this wasn't evident from the sheer craftsmanship that went into the blade as a whole, from the lowest point of the pommel to the sharp tip of the blade. The hilt itself was made with a wooden finish, clothed in a hand grip of dark orange cloth, with breaks in the shape of diamonds falling straight up the center. This flowed into the handguard, which instead of a typical rectangle, was in the shape of the Uzumaki swirl, with each point of the spiral flowing back into the hilt itself. The blade was a midnight black, with a groove down the center of each side somewhat reminiscent of a chokyudo, which had been filled in and treated until once again the color orange shone through. And finally, the sheath itself was a simple black, with an Uzumaki crest decorating the area just under the separation. Ordinary, and as he would come to in later years, Naruto would sling the katana over his shoulder and wear it in a standardized back harness. But soon after receiving the sword, he had realized just how short he actually was. Instead of sealing it away like Jiraiya had suggested, though the up-and-coming ninja had elected to carry it with him wherever he went. If Naruto was being honest with himself, he never felt whole without his sword. It was like carrying a piece of home with him, especially after he had learned just where the sword had come from. It had been 4 months since Jiraiya had left him. Well, not really left him per se, but the Sannin definitely had chosen to leave him behind while he attended to some personal business, as he had called it. So, the Toad Sage had called in a favor to an old friend, Mifune, the current leader of Iron Country. After no small amount of begging and promising a surprise for the old samurai upon his return, Jiraiya had turned Naruto over to Mifune and promptly exited the country to deal with whatever had come up. Naruto, being his hyperactive self, and this only becoming more and more amplified as he grew, had quickly taken to not only training on his own, but had begun to watch the samurai train in their own respective forms of kenjutsu. It wasn't long before Naruto had become infatuated with the way of the sword, and had begged and annoyed Mifune to no end until he agreed to train the boy. The young Uzumaki had taken to kenjutsu like a fish to water, and it wasn't long before he had begun training with the regular samurai, and through a clever use of shadow clones, had started to learn at an astonishing rate. Upon his return, and when Jiraiya had discovered this, he smiled to himself. Should have guessed the brat would find some way to get a hold of a sword. Kushina would be proud of him. Later that night, Jiraiya had sat the heir to the Uzumaki down and handed him a scroll. Confused, Naruto cautiously pricked his thumb and spilt some blood across the seal. In a quick puff of smoke, the sword Naruto would come to see as an extension of himself sat across his lap. With the sword was a letter, and while Jirya never read the letter himself, he was able to discern one major thing. It had been signed, "Your loving mother, Uzumaki Kushina." Apparently, he now had some explaining to do to Naruto about his family, but he supposed that that could wait until morning. He almost missed Jirya signing a copy of a familiar little orange book and handing it back to Mifune. Since that day and the following conversation on who his parents were, and then following that freakout about just who his parents were, the sword aptly named Kage no Karatoriki Wind Reaper rarely left his side. To Naruto, the blade was a piece of his mother that he could carry with him everywhere he went, and when he was in combat, it was like his mother was fighting by his side. He sighed before being pulled out of his thoughts by the toad sage once again speaking to him. "All right, Naruto. When we come up on the village, the first thing we have to do is report in to the Hokage, then we need to get you enrolled in the academy. After that, you're free to do as you want. I'll probably be busy with my research." The self-proclaimed super pervert managed to proclaim right before he nearly broke down into a fit of giggles. Naruto looked over his shoulder at his godfather. "Kami, and he's one of the strongest shinobi on the face of the earth, go figure." Naruto thought to himself, before returning his gaze to the road ahead of him and the near ominous-looking gates they were approaching. "Whatever you say, Iro-sensei, just try not to get us thrown out of the village like that time in Kumo, all right? I don't ever want to have to try and outrun a bunch of pissed-off kunoichi with swords again." The blonde mused, mostly to himself as he had come to realize that his sensei was next to useless when he got like this. Kotsu glared across at his old friend, Izumo, and sneered. Izumo glanced back up at him, a bead of sweat dropping across his brow as he rearranged the cards in his hand before locking eyes with his long-time pal-turned-nemesis. He looked down at his hand once more before making his decision. He had to trust his gut. His gut and instincts had gotten him through so many missions, gotten him through so many tight situations that it would be absurd to not trust it. It didn't matter that this was the last hand of the game, which had become so high stakes that even the legendary sucker Tsunade wouldn't have taken the bet. But he was in too deep now, too deep to back down. He was 10 miles behind enemy lines, and if Kotsu's smirk was anything to go by, he was screwed anyways. May as well go for it. Steeling himself after wiping the sweat off his brow one final time, he locked eyes with his opponent. "Kotsu, do you have any?" Izumo briefly hesitated, the tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a rusty butter knife, as he locked himself in and finished his question, "Fours." If nothing but a sheer look could kill, Izumo would have died 1,000 deaths from the smirk and following victorious screams that sounded from Kotsu. His eyes widening, Izumo nearly dropped his cigarette as he stared, open-mouthed at his now former friend who had picked up his newly acquired prize and had begun to gloat in an obscene manner. Izumo's hands dropped to his sides as he was utterly defeated, and his head fell to the table, tears forming in his eyes and vengeance forming in his heart. He had just lost his most prized possession, a once-in-a-lifetime photo of a certain Yuyuga Yuzuki while she was in the world-famous Konoha hot springs. The photo had cost him multiple shattered bones, several stab wounds, and 4 concussions, and that was only the first day. The photo and him had been through many, many good times together. But now, he watched on in abject horror as Kotsu carefully pocketed the picture, making some remark about how he couldn't wait for tonight. This was, consequently, the straw that broke the camel's back, and Izumo wasted no time in launching himself across the table and locking his hands around Kotsu's throat, as the latter attempted to desperately fight off his now enraged friend. This was the scene that Naruto and Jirya walked up to the gate upon. As the two travelers watched the scene, they glanced at each other, then back to the spectacle in front of them, and once again back to each other. Jirya shrugged, and was just about to clear his throat and make himself known, when a photograph drifted down to in front of him, landing face down, apparently pushed out by the brawl occurring in the guardhouse mere feet away. Bending down and picking it up, it wasn't long before he had once again broken down into a hysterical fit of perverse giggles, before immediately pulling out his notebook and beginning to scribble feverishly, a small trickle of blood dripping down his nose, and his signature peeping face plastered across his face. Naruto, guessing immediately what was happening, was quick to steal a glance of the photo as well, and then with a speed that someone wouldn't have expected from a person his age, wiped the blood from his nose while filing away a mental image. Naruto wasn't a pervert by any conventional means, at least. That isn't to say that he didn't enjoy the wonders of the female body. He was a budding man, after all. Several minutes later, after gleaning all the inspiration he could from the photo in question, Jirya tucked both his ever-present notebook and the evidence away. Grinning at Naruto one more time before clearing his throat, he walked up to the front of the guardhouse, finally gaining the attention of the two completely distracted gate guards. Izumo glared up at the offending party who had dared stop his righteous vengeance, already beginning with a witty retort that quickly died in his throat once he saw who he was addressing. Kotsu also glanced over, after wondering what could possibly have happened to stop the assault on him. Effectively prying Izumo's hands from around his throat, both men quickly stood to attention, having the decency to look just a little bit ashamed at what they had been caught doing. Jirya looked down at the two Chunin, crossing his arms. He slowly and deliberately looked each man dead in the eye, attempting to convey just how unacceptable this behavior was. Izumo opened his mouth to start a preemptive protest, but the words died in his mouth as Jirya threw his head back and let out his trademark laugh, soon joined in by Naruto at his side. Through barely contained laughter, Jirya managed to hand over the paperwork necessary for entry to the village. "Kami, boys." It must have been one hell of a game to end up like that. Jirya laughed out as he motioned to the now scattered cards that adorned the floor. Izumo, for his part, just mumbled something incomprehensible while Kotsu beamed at the toad sage. "You have no idea, Jirya-sama. It was worth every second. Who's the kid? He looks familiar, but I can't place him." Kotsu asked, looking over at raising an eyebrow at Naruto. "Naruto, Uzumaki Naruto. Pleased to meet you." Naruto held out his hand as he trailed off. "Kotsu, glad to meet you, kid. Good to have you in the village, actually. It's been too quiet since you left. No one can quite pull off all the pranks like you used to." Naruto grinned, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. "Yeah, well, I'll see what I can do about that." "No promises, though. I'm trying to make a good impression this time." Kotsu grinned at the sheepish young kid before handing all of Jirya's papers back to the toad sage and waving them through the gate. For the first time in 6 years, Uzumaki Naruto stepped foot on genuine Konoha soil, and honestly, it felt good to be home. He glanced once over his shoulder at the gatehouse when he heard Kotsu scream something along the lines of, "It's missing. I know I put it in this pocket. Where did it go?" Before dismissing it as one of the light-hearted shinobi's antics, and hurried to follow his sensei who had now gained significant ground on him. They had a meeting to keep, after all. Yamanaka Ino was, for lack of a better word, spoiled. She was also highly competitive, which when the two were paired is one hell of a combination. Now, when you take a girl who is used to always getting what she wants, and then you make her fight for something, one of two things is going to happen. The first being that she will simply give up on that particular item or obsession and attempt to get the next best thing, which is highly unlikely. Or, in the much more likely case, an instant rivalry will be formed between the two parties, ending only when one or the other gets the object of affection. So when Ino's longtime friend Haruno Sakura revealed to her that she wasn't the only one who liked Uchiha Sasuke, the friendship evolved to also form a friendly rivalry. This was the exact subject that she happened to be arguing over with her best friend as they walked along one of the main roads of Konoha. Well, that, and among other things, the various amenities of being a woman and the certain frivolities that they enjoy. She was so enraptured in her conversation that she didn't even have time to move out of the way when she rounded the corner, stumbling headfirst right into the lithe form of someone she didn't recognize. This was odd in itself, because being the social person that she was, it was a rare occurrence for Ino to not recognize somebody, especially in the streets near the Yamanaka clan district. It was because of her befuddlement that she at first didn't even hear what the young boy said as he took one of his hands off the katana resting across his shoulders to help her up. "I'm sorry, what?" she stammered as he pulled her up. "Sorry about that. I should have been paying attention to where I was going. I'm sorry," Naruto said, finishing pulling the fallen Yamanaka to her feet, merely inkling his head as Jirya said something about going on without him and not wanting to be in the way of young love. Naruto swore sometimes the toad sage could be a real pain in the ass, more or less abandoning him in a village he hadn't been to in years. "Ino, and this is Sakura. Are you new to the village? I haven't seen you around here before. Are you from a clan?" "You must be. You've got these two whisker, ma." The now introduced Ino was stopped in her tirade of questioning by the slightly embarrassed Sakura, who had deftly covered her friend's mouth with her hand. "Kami, Ino. No need to interrogate him. Sorry, what's your name again?" Naruto took a slight step back, before shifting his sword over to rest on one shoulder, think like Ikaku in Bleach, bringing his right back to scratch the back of his head in his signature sheepish motion. No, it's fine. It's been a while since people have asked me stuff like that. I'm Naruto, and yes, I am from a clan, but it died out a long time ago, and I'm the last one. It was nice to meet you, Sakura-san, Ino-san. But I've got to run, I'm already late, and I doubt that Gigi is going to be happy about it. Naruto yelled over his shoulder as he took off down the road before jumping, running up the wall of a nearby building and taking to the rooftops, heading towards the Hokage Tower. Back on the ground, Ino and Sakura watched him go, surprised by the sudden change in pace, and subsequently the slight, inadvertent demonstration of skill and chakra control that neither one of them had even begun to learn yet. Well, he seemed cool. You think he's going to the academy with us tomorrow? Ino, you think so? Hello, Earth to Ino. Sakura waved her hand in front of her best friend's face, finally gaining her attention. Ino looked over her shoulder at the retreating form of Naruto as Sakura pulled her off and back along the street. Yeah, sorry, Sakura. There's just something about him that seems familiar, like I've seen him before. Look at that dress. Come on, Sakura, let's go inside. Ino called out as she in turn began the one dragging Sakura into the new shop she had seen, all thoughts of the strange boy she had recently met gone for now. Naruto hit the ground running before launching himself straight up and forward at the Hokage Tower, hitting the side feet first and sprinting straight up the side. It wasn't long before he was nearing the top, and right as he was coming parallel to the window which led straight into the Hokage's office. He launched himself straight outward and off the building, spinning as he threw a kunai through the office window, impacting on the opposite wall. Pulling on the ninja wire attached to the knife, Naruto changed his momentum and launched himself through the open window, landing on the floor of the office before rolling once and coming to a stop on one knee, head bowed. This is it. Flashy entrance. Check. Recognition of authority. Check. Here we go. Uzumaki Naruto, reporting as ordered, Hokage-sama. Uzumaki Naruto, reporting as ordered, Hokage-sama. The Sandaime Hokage raised an eyebrow at the newest arrival to his office, through the damn window, no less. Absent-mindedly wondering if he would be able to break that habit of the young Naruto before it became so ingrained that it wouldn't be possible, the Hokage appraised his new appearance. It had appeared by the boy's submissive and respectful greeting that he at least had gained some respect for people in a position of authority over the last 6 years. It could also be garnered that Jiraiya hadn't been idle in his training of the boy, if his, albeit flashy, entrance was to go by. Hiruzen Sarutobi was not often surprised, especially not at his old age. The old man had been through a lot in his life, after all, and there wasn't much he hadn't seen or done. However, it was with pleasant surprise that the old Hokage allowed a small smile to grace his wrinkled face as he gazed down at the young man that kneeled before him. Naruto, please, stand up and come here, let me get a full look at you. It's been nearly 6 years since I've gotten a look at you. Gleamed Sarutobi as Naruto stood to his full height, bringing his sword to rest in his standard position of across his shoulders. And so respectful, too. Jiraiya must really have done a number on you these past few years. At this, the Sandaime chuckled before lowering himself back into his desk as the young Uzumaki began addressing the twice-serving Hokage. He definitely worked me pretty hard some days, Hokage-sama, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. I may not have had my real parents, but Iro-sensei was the next best thing. At this, Naruto paused, grinning, before rubbing the back of his head in his trademark look. You know, being my godfather and all. The silence that filled the room could have been shattered by a pin dropping, which it very nearly almost was, although not in the form of a pin, but rather with the Hokage's signature pipe. The old man had pulled it out and began packing it with some special tobacco, from Rice Country, if he remembered correctly, when he heard Naruto's revelation. It wasn't the fact that Jiraiya was his godfather that surprised him. No, he already knew that. In fact, it had been Jiraiya himself who had told him the very same day that Minato and Kushina had revealed that they had chosen him for the title. No, the part that made the usually very composed and reserved shinobi nearly drop his pipe was the fact that Naruto himself knew of Jiraiya's stance in his life. The once revered god of shinobi looked at the young Uzumaki before snapping his head to the left, making eye contact with his former student. Jiraiya, explanation, now. By the tone in his voice and his clipped sentence, it was very clear to all in the room that there was no longer an atmosphere for tomfoolery, and serious answers would only be accepted. Jiraiya, for his part, at least had the decency to look sheepish, as he took a page out of Naruto's book and scratched the back of his head in near-mock embarrassment. Well, you see, Sarutobi, I actually had to tell him. It happened while we were back in the land of iron. You remember how I had to leave Naruto there for a little while. I took care of a lead on a certain snake. Well, anyways, I come back, and the kid has become quite the little Kenjutsu master. So I give him the scroll from Kushina, and as it turns out, she had sealed a letter in with her old sword as well. Before I could stop him, Naruto had read the whole thing, and suffice to say, he can be very persuasive when he needs to. At this, Jirya had a momentary flashback of the Uzumaki in question, holding the last seal of some fire jutsu, with all of his compiled research notebooks lying in a pile a short distance away. It's all right, Hokage-sama, I know why you hid it from me, but I'm stronger now. I've fought and trained, and I'm good. I'm not worried about Tusan's or Kasan's enemies. If they were going to send someone after me, they'd have done it by. I mean, everyone's got to know who I am. It's not exactly hard to figure out. The young Uzumaki practically yelled, dropping the calm and collected facade that he had been carrying for the earlier part of his debrief. He walked over to the window and stood facing inward, his face adjacent to that of the fallen fourth Hokage. I mean, come one Jiji, Naruto sighed, not even noticing his slip of the tongue that reverted him to his younger self. I don't know how I didn't see it, let alone everyone else. Aside from my whiskers, I'm a spitting image. Sarutobi looked onward, switching between Naruto and Jirya, before sighing to himself and looking down. For once, he was glad he had the foresight to send his office's ANBU guards out before the special debrief had started. He had been against keeping the truth from Naruto from the very beginning, but had been unfortunately overruled by the council, as had been happening more often than not lately. Ever since they had managed to grab more political power within the village in the short absence between the death of the fourth and the ascension to power of the third. Deciding to just make his decision now in a rather short moment of impulsiveness, the Sandaime opened one of the many hidden drawers on his desk and retrieved a scroll from inside. Steeling himself, he looked at the scroll in his hand one final time before motioning Naruto over to him and handing it to the dull blonde. Naruto, this was left to you by both of your parents. It contains everything that you will need to gain entrance to the Namikaze estate in the fourth quadrant of the residential area. The place was well protected with seals the last time I went there, so I'd follow whatever instructions were in there to the letter. You are free to leave, as I'm sure you'd rather explore your new home than stay here for a debrief that Jirya can easily handle. At that, and with a clipped Hokage-sama, Naruto placed the scroll in question into the pouch on the back of his left him, before standing and vanishing in a swirl of leaves via Shunshin. After watching the young Uzumaki leave and verifying that the room's integrity was still secure, he brought his hands to his temple, rubbing his forehead slowly and in circles. He had a feeling that this meeting he was having with his old student was going to be over later, rather than sooner. This idea was only further cemented in his head as Jirya took a seat in front of him, producing a bottle of sake and a pair of saucers from seemingly nowhere, setting them on the table and beginning to pour them both a gracious amount. Sarutobi merely looked up at his former student before allowing a sly smile to slip onto his face once again. So, he knows the Shunshin too, eh? Jirya, now finished pouring their drinks, handed one to his sensei. Hiruzen, you don't even know the half of it. And with that, he began to tell his sensei what had happened since he had taken Naruto from the village so many years ago. Naruto sat in the one place in the village he had always felt truly safe, sound, or secure, the top of the Hokage monument. Or rather, more specifically, the top of the Yondaime Hokage's head. It made sense, now that he thought about it. For the first 4 years of his life, Naruto would take the long pilgrimage up the far side of the mountain, climbing the several thousand steps to the top of the monument. Once at the top, the usually hyperactive 4-year-old would just sit for hours on end on one of the various heads of the leaders of his village, sometimes in silence, but more often than not he would have a conversation with one or more of the stone statues. While he would have talks and make up dialogue between himself and the other leaders, his favorite to sit on was always that of the Yondaime. He had never understood why he always felt connected to that one, but now he had all the reason and more to understand the strange connection that he used to feel. It was up here that Naruto would come to think, to vent, or just to have someone to talk to. He honestly couldn't even begin to count the times he had come up here. So as it was, it made sense that one of the first places he would come to after his return to Konoha would be the top of the Hokage monument. As he took his usual seat placed in the forward center of the Yondaime's head, overlooking the village, he couldn't help but sigh in content. While it was true that the village had left him with many awful memories full to the brim with abuse, suffering, and pain. Those memories were also now 6 years past. Plus, Naruto was far from defenseless now. Jiraiya had even told him on their return to Konoha that he would peg him at about mid-Chunin level, which for his young age he had been reassured was extremely well. When he had asked Jiraiya about his substantial growth, the Sannin had told him to just chalk it up to a combination of his own hard work ethic, Jiraiya's awesome teaching skills, his words, not Naruto's, and a very liberal amount of Kage Bunshin. It was now, while Naruto was sitting up here, which he was mulling over his recently acquired scroll. Sighing to himself and stealing his emotions, Naruto brought his right hand to his mouth, biting down on his thumb, and then smearing the now flowing blood across the sealing matrix of the scroll, unsealing it in a small pull of smoke. When the smoke had cleared, a small envelope lay in Naruto's lap. Wasting no time in picking it up and quickly tearing it open, Naruto began to read the last memento of his father, not even noticing nor caring about the tears that were beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. Later on, he wouldn't remember it raining. The Namikaze estate in itself wasn't really anything special to look at. This was a far statement from saying that it was a dump, but it certainly was nowhere near as grand as the Hyuga clan compound, or anywhere close to as ominous as the now desolate Uchiha clan district. No, the Namikaze estate was quite unassuming, and in all honesty, if you didn't know who it belonged to, the house itself could be mistaken for that of a well-off merchant or that of an unassuming shinobi. It was a simple, two-story building that was adjacent to the Nara clan compound on the left, and due to this was boarded on two sides that led into the large border wall separating the two clans, beyond which was the large forested area that the Nara used to tend their deer. All in all, the Namikaze estate itself wasn't anything to write home about. Those were the first thoughts that Naruto had when he jumped off of one of the adjoining roofs of a nearby house, landing in the street directly in front of the home, his new home. Taking a breath, Naruto walked up to the front door of the house, and then following the instructions left by his father, swiped his, once again, bloody palm across the door, watching with subdued interest as a sealing matrix briefly appeared on the door before he heard a small but still quite audible click. Steeling himself and glancing around him real quick, Naruto gripped the door handle, opening it, and walking inside. To say that Naruto was surprised would be a slight understatement. There was not a hint of dust in the place, despite having been the equivalent of abandoned for the better part of 10 years. Everything in the room was still exactly as his parents had left it, and had he been old enough to remember it, he was sure nothing had changed. As he walked through the house, Naruto found himself constantly choking in near sorrow and reminiscent love. He walked through the kitchen of the house, idly placing Kage's no Karatoriki, Wind Reaper, on the large wooden table, as we opened cupboards and moved around, absent-mindedly creating a couple of Kage Bunshin to clear out all of the expired goods. Even the passage of time cannot be stopped with seals, he noted, seeing one of his clones nearly lose its composure over a container of very expired milk. Having enough of that, Naruto found himself in a hallway with a door on either side. Mentally flipping a coin, he headed into the room on the left, and what he found there would occupy him for quite the extended time, to say the least. Placing either hand on the desk in what was apparently his father's study, Naruto couldn't help but feel inadequate to his father's recognized genius. On the table in front of him were several Hurei Kanai, and unable to stop himself, Naruto immediately grabbed one and threw it against one of the adjoining walls, waiting for the signature flash that came to define the yondaime. Frowning when it never occurred, he looked down at the desk, finding it littered with his late father's notes on his signature jutsu. But after quickly looking through them, it was discovered that Naruto would only be able to use them as a guideline to fashioning the jutsu for his own use, as unfortunately it wasn't as simple as being of Namikaze blood. Naruto replaced the notes, and made a mental one to get better at seals so he could one day come to use the Hurei. He did want to surpass his father, and all the previous Hokage after all. Exiting the room, he passed through the doorway opposite on the other side of the hall, and for as much mental preparing he had begun since he stepped through the front door, and for as much as he tried to compose himself, it was still quite hard to stem the flow of tears that came to his eyes as he found himself standing in a room that was very clearly meant for a newborn child. With a crib against the wall, a mobile hanging from the ceiling, and various chests and such around the room, it was obvious who this room belonged to or was supposed to. Naruto kneeled down, and clutching the picture frame he had grabbed when he visited his parents' old room, he broke down. Unable to hold back the proverbial dam that had finally burst, Naruto cried. He cried long and hard until finally it seemed that there were no more tears that would come, and then glancing down at the picture held in his hands, he stood. He needed some air and he still had a lot to do today. They were good people, Naruto. I loved Minato like my own son. Naruto jumped but calmed himself when he recognized the voice belonged to Jiraiya. Naruto looked over his right shoulder at the man who had raised him for the last 6 years, and it was still quite evident that he had been sobbing. He looked back down at the photo in his hands, and his head drooped. Jiraiya walked a little closer to the young blonde and placed one of his large hands on his shoulder, gripping softly but still tightly. He was here to try and comfort his godson, and in the back of his mind he knew that this would take a while, so he was happy that he had already taken care of all of Naruto's registration for the academy. Hey, come on, we're back in the village. It's been years, so let's go explore. What was the name of that ramen stand you always used to talk about? Jiraiya tried to prod the young man into some action, anything really, to get him moving. He knew Naruto, and the best way to get him out of a slump was to either train or to get him to the nearest ramen stand and allow him to gorge himself to his heart's content. And, considering that Jiraiya, although revered as one of the strongest ninja in the elemental countries, was also quite lazy when he chose to be, training was out of the option. Naruto looked up at his sensei, a small semblance of light returning to his blue eyes. You mean Ikaraku's? I think they are still open. I didn't get the chance to check earlier because of the meeting with the old man. Naruto trailed off as Jiraiya had at this point practically grabbed him, and after Naruto made sure to pick up Kage's no Karatoriki, shoved him out the door. Jiraiya, while not the best person to attempt to comfort others, was very adept at helping distract people from their problems. Unfortunately for Naruto, his current problem was one that only time and consistency could heal, and it was something that, while other people may be able to help comfort him, it was ultimately something that he would have to face alone. Saying that I was bored was akin to saying that the ocean was wet. The stand itself was in something of a decline for the last few days, but it was sure to pick up again due to its close proximity to the Ninja Academy, which was starting up tomorrow. Unfortunately, that was tomorrow, not today, and there had been no customers in the cozy little ramen stand today. No, today maybe she'd try and talk to her dad, maybe convince him to close up the shop a little earlier than normal, and she'd go out. As she was going through what she wanted to do for the next few hours to try and pass the time, she almost missed the short, lithe frame of an old family friend walk into the small, unassuming shop and take a seat on one of the several bar stools. Seeing as how he was still unnoticed, the lone man raised an eyebrow at the young, petite woman behind the bar who was seemingly staring off into space before clearing his throat to get her attention. Iam was pulled out of her subconscious contemplating quick enough and snapped her head around fast enough to nearly make her head spin. Blushing sheepishly, she raised a hand both in greeting and in an apologetic manner as she addressed the first customer of the day. Oh, sorry. I wasn't paying attention. Anyways, welcome to Ikaraku. What can I get you? Iam managed to stammer out after a quick second of thought, pulling a notebook and pen out from her apron, preparing to take the strange, but albeit familiar, newcomer. The short man looked up at Iam, and she couldn't help but feel that she knew him from somewhere. There was just too much about him that reminded her of someone, but she just couldn't place it for someone. Naruto chuckled, and without even looking at the menu, ordered off of memory, nearly shocking Iam with the sheer magnitude of his order. Good afternoon, Iam Nichin. I'll take 4 bowls of miso ramen, 2 of pork, and 3 of chicken to start. And tell old man Tuch I say hi. Naruto called out, which was all it took for the wheels in the young barmaid's head to finish turning, and she whispered at first, almost to herself, Naruto. All Naruto could do was grin. He was a little skeptical that the 2 ramen stand owners would know him, and the last thing he wanted to do now was have to reintroduce himself to all of his old friends. It was a pleasant change of pace, at least, especially since Jiraiya had bylaid on him almost as soon as they left the Namikaze estate. He had said something about having to make a report or something, but in truth, Naruto had only been half listening, and he knew that if he needed the man, he could always find him at the hot springs or the women's bath, partaking in his research. It wasn't long before Iam had bent as far over the counter as she could, grabbing Naruto and pulling him into a new bone-crushing hug that he guessed was both happy to see him and was meaning to try and make up for all the years he missed. Naruto, whilst being suffocated by his pseudo-older sister, was barely able to hear her calling out to her dad, and telling him to come up and see their long-lost best customer. It was here, being crushed to death by an absurdly strong ramen stand waitress, that Naruto realized just how much he had missed his traditional home. That's not to say that he didn't enjoy the many years he had spent traveling all across the elemental nations with Jirya, but it was nice to know that he now had a place to stay, with new and old friends both budding and waiting for him. As he spent the next couple hours at the homely little ramen stand telling tales of his travels with the great toad sage, Naruto came to a realization. Maybe he was wrong about his misgivings about coming back to Konoha. A few hours later, when the sun was setting over the back of the Hokage monument, Naruto finally called it a day, and upon saying goodbye to Ayame and Chuchai, Naruto began his walk home, opting this time to take a longer, more scenic route, if you will, towards his new home, which in all practicality wasn't that far from the stand. Idly thinking that this may be a problem, considering he had quite the fixation on the sustenance of the gods themselves, Naruto rounded another corner, headed for home. He had a long day ahead of him, after all, and if he was being honest with himself, a long year until he could attempt to take the Academy's final exam early and become a Genin in 1 year instead of the typical 3. As smart and as strong as he was, the Hokage had refused to give him special treatment on the matter, and he would still have to attend just like every other Konoha shinobi. Oh well, he would make it work. It was doubtful, but maybe he'd even learn something, and there was always the possibility of making friends. The Hokage had made it seem quite adamant that he at least attempt to bond with his classmates, as it was very likely that he would eventually be working with them on missions later in life. Even Naruto had to admit that it made sense, considering having a rapport with someone made it easier to understand each other. As he turned onto his street and was greeted with the sight of his parents, his house, he was reminded that currently the only bed in the house was his parents'. He shrugged to himself. He'd send some clones out in the morning to renovate the house and change things to better suit his own image. Not that he wanted to completely erase his parents' touch on the house, quite the opposite, in fact. He simply needed to move some things around in the house to better suit him, since he was the only person who lived there after all. He sighed to himself and opened the door to his home, glancing over his shoulder once at the moonlit night before shutting the door and going to bed. Things were beginning to look up. He never noticed the lone ANBU operative watching him from an rooftop down the road, and he would have no idea that they wrote something on a scroll before bending down, summoning a small raven, and sending it off, scroll in tow, before leaving the area themselves. Uzumaki Naruto looked up at the large frame of the Leaf's Ninja Academy building. Like most of the other buildings in Konohagakure no Sato, it was of a large wooden frame with a slanted roof. The building itself was set in a slightly sectioned-off area of the village, with the back area of the academy opening up into several large training grounds that were used for various activities by the academy and its classes. All in all, if one were a small child attending the academy for the first time, it could be considered even ominous. However, for the newest resident of the village, it was just another building. What could he say? He had traveled the elemental nations for years, lived with one of the 3 Sannin, and hell, he'd already jumped one of the major milestones for a ninja, that being obtaining his first kill. So all said, to Naruto it was just a building. Gripping his ever-present katana, Naruto rested it across his shoulders and headed towards inside. Making his way down the hall, the young Uzumaki stopped at the last classroom on the left and entered, unaware that the class was already underway. "Ah, and you must be Naruto. Welcome to the class. You can take a seat in the open one over there. I'm Uruka." A chunin with a large scar across his nose, hair done up in a spiked ponytail, and a standard flak jacket greeted him, motioning him to a seat on the far side, next to what he assumed to be an Inuzuka and an Aburame, if the dog on top of the boy's head and the trademark coat and glasses, respectively, were anything to go by. Nodding his head and shuffling over to the aforementioned seat, Naruto swung his sword off of his shoulders and around his head before lowering it to the ground to lean against his chair, before taking a seat himself. The Inuzuka, he soon learned, was named Kiba, and Naruto had a feeling the two would get along just fine, considering how the young dog lover acted. And while the smaller Aburame, who he'd come to learn was called Shino, was just as stoic and logical as he would have expected of a member of that clan, he too was just as welcome company to Naruto. There were a few friendly faces in the crowd as well, though in the faces of Yamanaka Ino and Haruno Sakura, so it wasn't as if Naruto was completely in the dark. although the two girls seemed much more interested in fawning over the brooding Uchiha heir than learning to become ninja. Sighing, Naruto closed his eyes for a few moments, leaning his head back and crossing his arms. Hopefully the year would be over soon, and then he could start on the long road to surpass his father and become a true ninja of the leaf. The first few days of the academy passed slowly for the young blonde, but if he thought about it, he should really have expected nothing less. For all of his faults, Jiraiya was actually a fairly good teacher when he wasn't off conducting his research. And if one were to take into account all Naruto had been able to glean from his and his sensei's multitude of travels, in addition to all the people he had and in turn, learned from, it wasn't all that surprising that the academy was boring the poor kid to tears. All in all, Naruto himself even knew that he was drastically over the basic skill and knowledge required for any typical first-year student. Which is why, when one were to consider that this particular student knew the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu and its benefits, it wasn't at all a far stretch to imagine that he'd send a clone to the academy, while he would remain at home and either train or explore his now return to home. Which is exactly what the young Uzumaki's question was doing today. While he had made a good number of clones that remained at his house working on the various ninja arts from fuinjutsu to ninjutsu, Naruto himself was out walking the village. It had only been a few days since he had returned, and although he had by this point managed to get in touch with all of his out friends and acquaintances, which weren't many, but still, and although he wasn't really looking for anyone or anything in particular, it was still nice to get out and about. While Naruto was enjoying having a house to himself, and was more so interested in looking through all of his past parents' effects, every so often it would become too much for the 10-year-old. He may have been smarter and more mature than nearly everyone in his age group, but he was still only a child. It was as he was walking along on this day, a short while after leaving his new, or would it be considered old, favorite ramen stand in the form of Ikaraku's, that he found himself wandering past the multitude of Konoha's training grounds, and upon hearing the unmistakable sound of something impacting the nearby trees, Naruto decided to check it out. He figured that the absolute worst-case scenario would be that whoever was training would tell him to leave, but in a more positive light, he might even get a spar out of it. Walking into the grounds, Naruto was nearly caught off guard when all the noise ceased the minute he set foot into the clearing. Wondering if he had somehow imagined the noise or maybe it was just wishful thinking, he was about to turn and leave, but not before his instincts screamed at him. And so, after spending years out with Jiraiya and honing his instincts, Naruto spun on his heel, dropped his shoulders, and in a fluid motion unsheathed Kage's no Kara Toriki, using it to deflect the 4 shuriken that had been aimed in pairs at each of his shoulders. Listening to his now raging sense of danger, Naruto only barely managed to spin his sword tip first into the ground before pivoting and holding himself above it by one hand, only just escaping a Fuuma shuriken that had been sent at him from the left, before getting pulled back towards him on the now obvious ninja wire that was attached to its rotating center. Widening his eyes at the closing fast quad-bladed weapon, Naruto was able to quickly make a Kage Bunshin that served its short-lived purpose of pulling him out of the way before taking the hit for him. Falling on the ground in a misshapen bulk, Naruto was unable to fully stick the landing, instead rolling off to the side and reaching for his abandoned sword. It was not to be, though, for as soon as Naruto looked over to where his blade stood, still quivering in the ground from where he had stabbed it, 3 things happened in rapid succession, and he never even stood a chance to avoid it. First, the ground beneath him seemed to open up, sinking him knee-deep into it before it hardened again, effectively trapping his legs. Reacting quickly for someone his age to this setback, Naruto was fast to begin blurring his hands through some seals. But before he could complete his chosen technique, a multitude of snakes emerged from around the tree almost directly behind him, encircling him and trapping his arms at his sides, the myriad of heads poking out of their constriction at the top, fangs bared and mere inches from his exposed neck. The third and final thing that occurred in this matter of a few seconds was that Naruto heard someone clapping, but not in the "I'm happy for you, good job" way, but more in the condescending, "I'm surprised that you managed to get that far" slow clap. Looking up and over to his left, Naruto was able to make out the form of woman approaching him. If he had to hazard a guess, she stood at about 5'3" and had dark purple hair. The woman was dressed in a long gray trench coat, and although Naruto couldn't quite see from the angle he was at, it didn't appear that she was wearing anything underneath but some light fishnet clothing. Doing his best to ignore the several snakes that were still constricting in on his body, Naruto attempted to fix the woman with a glare, knowing it was a weak one at best. Well, what have we got here? I just know that everyone here knows that this is my training ground. And I also know that everyone in this village knows not to disturb me when I'm, let's call it venting my frustrations. The obviously agitated woman said to him, in what was quite honestly a sickeningly sweet tone as she maneuvered herself around behind him, before approaching the bound Uzumaki and drawing a kunai, placing it against his cheek, and slowly dragging its tip along one of the two fading whisker marks there, drawing just enough blood to allow it to carry over onto the blade itself. Drawing the knife up to her lips, the kunoichi moved her head close enough to Naruto's side just to where she'd be slightly in view, and licked his blood off of her knife before fixing him with a predatory grin and speaking once again. You know, the guys who think they are the strongest, their blood always tastes the best. She moved her arm and the knife around to the other side of his head, attempting to cut him once more, but this time when she dug her kunai into his cheek, the Naruto, she thought she had popped out of existence in a small puff of smoke. The kunoichi blinked once in mild surprise before she bent her body back at an almost unnatural angle, dodging the blade that had appeared where her chest had been moments before. She moved in to strike, albeit holding back a large amount as she had already gauged her young adversary's level of skill. Watching as he jumped back, she loaded another kunai into her hand, looking the challenger dead in the eyes. Clever use of a Kage bunchin and a substitution, I like it. But you blew your trick early, kid, so I hope you're ready, because Anko Mitarashi doesn't do the whole take it easy on the kids thing. The now revealed Anko grinned as she dropped another kunai into her free hand. Sure, she was no kenjutsu expert, but she felt she could take on some punk kid in the very least. Naruto, meanwhile, was honestly stumped. He had known of only one person in Konoha who had used snakes as a summons, and he knew Orochimaru had defected from the village and left. Rolling back to his entry, he wasn't even sure what he had done to warrant being attacked like this. As to his knowledge, all he had done was walk into the clearing to see what was going on, and before he knew it, he was trapped in a jutsu he would have had no chance of escaping had he not managed to create a clone the moment he was attacked. I have never been gladder that I was able to learn to make those seamlessly than I am right now. He mused, and he was now pulling a full retreat through the woods. Naruto had contemplated trying to fight her, but as he had correctly guessed, she was a Jounin, and although quite strong for his age, Naruto wasn't even technically a Genin yet, and that was quite the power gap. Naruto slammed his blade tip first into a tree, using the momentum to spin himself around it and into another, landing on it feet first, and then threw a conscious overload of chakra through the soles of his feet, exploded off of the tree while flashing through hand seals for one of the few jutsu he had managed to truly master at this point, and with a shout of futon, diatapa, wind style, great breakthrough. He managed to force a large gale of wind to off-balance the blur that had been Anko, noticing surprise written over her face with no small amount of pleasure. As he continued his assault, as he pulled 4 kunai from the pouch on his thigh, throwing them at the 4 limbs of Anko's body. As she contorted her body and dodged out of the way of his apparently wayward knives, Naruto grinned, not yet appreciating the merit of keeping a smooth face when in combat to avoid giving your opponent any advantage. The Tokubetsu Jounin, being every bit deserving of her rank, had no trouble not noticing the small, unannounced change in Naruto as he pulled his left hand back, revealing that the kunai had been attached to various ninja wire, effectively pulling the kunai that had passed her to spin on axis and return towards her back. Naruto had thought this through, a 2-pronged attack that spanned 2 fronts, and although he was a highly skilled genin-to-be, Naruto was still just a kid, which is why when Anko spun on her hands and effectively dodged all of his kunai, effectively sending his own attack back at him, that he was quite surprised to say the least. Dodging his own attack wasn't too difficult as he used his sword to parry them and slide out of the way of the subsequent fireball that was sent at him from his left. But the attack that truly caught him off guard and ended the fight came in the form of Anko's now signature, Sene Jashu, striking shadow snakes, appearing and latching onto his airborne leg, before pulling him down like a grape from a vine, and slamming him into several trees and the ground before relenting. Right as the ground formed over his body yet again, it wasn't long before the Tokubetsu Jounin who had launched the attack jumped gracefully out of one of the nearby trees, landing on the trapped blonde and straddling his earth-covered torso. You know, kid, that wasn't too bad of a warm-up. You're not too bad for a gaki. Anko trailed off as she sat on the young boy's chest, crossing her arms under her considerable bust, and revealing to Naruto that he had guessed correctly, and she in fact wasn't wearing anything other than a fishnet mesh bodysuit and a small miniskirt. Glaring up at his captor, and doing his best to keep the red from forming on his face, Naruto finally found his voice. Thanks, I'd say the same for you, but actually I'm still pretty pissed about why I was attacked in the first damn place. Why the hell did you do that for, huh? All I was doing was walkie. Naruto found his tirade promptly cut off as the once pleasant visage. And view he had had of Anko was replaced rather suddenly with an angered face inches from his, and a kunai once again placed at his throat, not quite hard enough to draw blood, but enough so that when he swallowed on instinct it pained him. The look in Anko's eyes made it very clear there would be no room for negotiation in her next few statements, and she pressed the kunai he was now more than aware of into his throat slightly harder. Listen here, Naruto, she grinned at his questioning reaction to her knowing his name. He didn't know that the talk of several of the upper-class jounin had been of the young Uzumaki's return. Hey, she could gossip too. This is my training ground. Training ground 44 is mine. Are we clear on that? This is my haven from the village, and most ninja know to leave me be because what you just got was a very small dose of my skill, understand? Upon seeing Naruto nod and glaring into his eyes once more for good measure, Anko stood up, dusted herself off, and after returning her kunai to their various hiding places, she began to walk off. That is, up until she heard the angry blonde yelling at her from his place rooted to the ground. Turning back, she leaned against one of the various nearby trees close to where Naruto's head lay. You're just going to leave me here, tied up on the ground, knowing damn well I have no way to get out. Yeah, real fair you psychotic bit, Naruto started before once again he was threatened that day with promise of death, this time in the form of a shuriken impacting the ground close enough to his head to take a few hairs off. Tapping her chin thoughtfully, Anko looked down upon her little captive, a thought forming in her mind before leaning down directly in front and above him. Well, I suppose I could be convinced to, she trailed off, for a price, that is. I haven't eaten yet today, and I could always go for some dango. She mused before Naruto sighed to himself. With his luck, she could probably eat dango like his new friend Chouji could eat. Well, anything for that matter. However, seeing as how he didn't really have a choice, he reluctantly agreed to treat the older Kunoichi to her favorite treat, and before he could really grasp what was happening, he had been released from Anko's trapping earth jutsu and was being dragged through the streets towards some dango shop Anko knew. He had no idea his earlier musing about the similarities between the little Akimichi heir and the former apprentice of the snake Sannin would be so undeniably true. Several hours later, Naruto exited the dango shop Anko had dragged him to, looking inside his much lighter wallet before grimacing and returning it, its designated pocket on the back of his trousers. Sighing to himself before slinging his sword up and over his shoulders and bringing his arms to rest on it, he started his walk for him, a massive headache already on the rise from the massive dispelling of his clones a few moments prior. The trip out to the training grounds had certainly been an interesting trip, and although he had lost a considerable amount of his hard-earned money buying Anko and by proxy himself several plates of dango, he had finally, albeit begrudgingly, paid off his debt to Anko for letting him out of her trap instead of leaving him there. And then after a few more plates, he had even convinced her to train with him when she wasn't on missions or busy. It may not have been as often as he liked, but now he had a legitimate training partner sensei who would be around for a while. Seeing as how Jirya had left the day prior, he did still have to maintain his spy network. Naruto had found himself in a bit of a rut. Training himself was simple and efficient when you could learn ninjutsu and fuinjutsu from various scrolls, and chakra control was becoming second nature to him at this point, even despite his absurdly large reserve or chakra. But there were some things that you absolutely needed to learn with a partner, and taijutsu, for one thing, was something that you could only get better at by sparring against someone who was stronger than you. Oh well, he mused. It had been a rather eventful day all around. He had a new pseudo-sensei, and he had started to make strides into his studies into fuinjutsu. The only bad thing is that he had almost been killed a few times today, but he supposed he could write that off to a more than friendly spar and call it a day. He opened the door to his home, which had now been furnished, and stepped inside before heading upstairs to his parents' old bedroom, which he was still trying to get used to calling his own. He looked around and nodded. His clones had done a fairly good job of furnishing the house, which he supposed wasn't too surprising considering that his clones were, well, him. As his headache became more borderline on the realm of a migraine, Naruto quite literally fell onto his bed, promptly passing out due to his now nearly healed wounds, exhaustion, and just general overexertion. His final thought of the night was that he figured Anko would be kicking him across the clearing many more times in the near future before was able to land a solid blow on her. During his spar with the snake mistress of Konoha, he had never noticed the ANBU in the trees, watching the entire match, and if Anko had seen him, she never said anything either. Naruto had been outside in his ample backyard, working on his rendition of the Rasengan that he had been taught by Jiraiya many years ago. While off scattered around the small clearing were various groups of clones practicing everything from seal writing and kanji craftsmanship to shuriken jutsu and even ninjutsu theory. It was while we was working on attempting to get the Rasengan to its third step. He was still having trouble making that godforsaken rubber ball explode like Jiraiya had shown him several weeks ago, that he suddenly froze, stopping all activity between him and his clones, his eyes going wide as the memories of one of his dispelled clones reached him. More specifically, the clone who had been designated to go in his place to class had fallen asleep at his desk during one of Uruka's more boring lectures. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be a problem, but when Uruka had noticed this, he had thrown an eraser with incredibly accuracy, nailing the sleeping Naruto directly in the head and dispelling the clone. Ordering his remaining clones to continue their work, Naruto quickly grabbed Kage's no Kara Toriki before disappearing from his yard in a flurry of leaves, before reappearing on a rooftop some distance away, and then repeating the process in a flurry of shunshuns across the many rooftops of Konoha. Between his realization of what had happened, the order to his clones, and then his mad rush across Konoha to the classroom, about 4 minutes had passed before Naruto appeared outside the window of the classroom. And then, waiting as Uruka finished yelling at the class to stay in their seats while he stepped out to go and talk to the administration office of the school, Naruto very stealthily opened the window at the rear of the room and slipped inside. Before walking over to his seat, amidst the bewildered gazes of his classmates, slinging his signature blade across his shoulders and placing it down beside his chair, the heir of the Uzumaki took his seat, leaned back, and let his hands fall into a comfortable position behind his head, doing his best to ignore the looks and the several questions he was getting from some of the more obnoxious members of his class, choosing instead to shut his eyes and lean his head back, right after glancing at his possibly best friend in the class, Kiba. He gave him a sly wink-mouthed Kage Bunshin to him. As Kiba was about to ask more questions, though, Uruka chose that moment to enter the room, and upon turning around and seeing Naruto sitting in his class, he was unsurprisingly suspicious. Walking up to the seemingly unassuming blonde, Naruto merely raised an eyebrow at the approaching teacher. "Is something wrong, Uruka-sensei?" Naruto questioned, his hands still folded behind his head half-cocked to the side. But although he was doing a very amiable and quite impressive innocent look, on the inside the last Uzumaki was nearly panicking. Uruka had to know that something was going on. He had seen Naruto literally poof into smoke. But he sincerely doubted that his teacher knew he was quite proficient in the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. If he played this right, he might be able to just get away free, but only if he were able to play it cool. While all these thoughts were running through Naruto's mind, the scar-faced Chunin instructor had made his way through the classroom up to Naruto's designated desk, still placed in between Kiba and Shino. Placing a hand on either side of the young boy's desk, Uruka got in close to Naruto, inspecting the child, looking over every angle of his face before leaning back and nodding, and turning to walk away. As he did so, Naruto moved to let out the breath he had unconsciously been holding, only to barely duck out of the way as Uruka spun and lashed out with his right first, hoping to cuff the boy on the side of the head, but only catching air, before revealing it had only been a feint, and threw a piece of chalk from his left hand, nailing Naruto directly between the eyes, and watched as the chalk not only made contact with him, but bounced off of his forehead, landing on the blonde's desk. Naruto, for his part, looked only slightly disgruntled at the situation, before looking directly into Uruka's eyes, watching as the man simply looked at him, then the piece of chalk, then back to him before nodding his head slightly, before grinning slightly. "Naruto," began their de facto sensei, believing he had figured out how to find out whether or not one of his students had actually somehow managed to ditch class, while still being there. "What were we discussing in class right before I walked out?" And this is when it was Naruto's turn to smile, for because of the greatness of the Kage Bunshin, he actually knew the answer. And he knew it would drive his sensei insane on the inside to know that he knew, while not even being present, and that his sensei would likely lose sleep attempting to figure out how he accomplished such a feat, never once suspecting that Naruto knew the Kage Bunshin no jutsu. So it was with complete and utter confidence that Naruto looked deep into the eyes of his sensei, and while everyone in the room watched with bated breath, he was able to respond coolly and with confidence. "Sure thing, Uruka-sensei. You were teaching us about the concept of genjutsu and theory of illusions." Uruka looked at him once more before standing up, leaning back into his full standing position, and motioning to his co-instructor, Mizuki, telling him to take the class outside and to conduct them into sparring matches while he went and got a drink. Shrugging, Mizuki watched as Uruka left. The poor man could just get so upset sometimes. It was kind of funny to the silver-haired Chunin. "All right, you heard him. Let's go get some impromptu sparring matches going. It'll be call out, fight out." And with that, Naruto sighed, grabbing his katana and followed the rest of the class outside. He glanced over in the direction of the lone Uchiha. Sasuke, if he wasn't mistaken, the two had never really talked, but the brooding kid had been eyeing him ever since the first day he had shown up to class, and today was the first day where they were allowed to choose their sparring partners. And Naruto knew exactly who would be itching at the chance to fight him, especially after the stunt he had just pulled in the classroom. As the class reconvened around the sparring grounds behind the academy, looks and conversation were flying amongst the classmates, and for once, Naruto himself was actually participating, instead of it being one of his clones as per his usual MO. Speaking of which, the current heir to the Uzumaki clan was standing around with his typical group of friends, which consisted primarily of Kiba, Shino, Chauji, and even the class's own resident lazy genius, Nara Shikamaru, who was telling everyone just how much of a drag this sparring match would be, while Mizuki explained the rules to them, more or less culminating in one person calling out another to a taijutsu spar, ending on his call. "And as usual, if and when I call the match, both participants will stop and leave the ring when the next match will start. Any questions?" Glancing around and gleaning from the lack of raised hands that there were in fact no questions, Mizuki crossed his arms and stood center on the ring, before motioning to Chauji that he was first, who unsurprisingly called out Shikamaru and culminated into one of the most boring taijutsu matches that many had ever seen. Naruto, watching the match, if it could be called that, just smirked and placed his head in hand, laughing softly about the comical mess it had been, especially when it ended when both parties involved in the spar more or less gave up after 2 or 3 punches. Unfortunately, his jovial mood wasn't to last, though, as the very next person that Mizuki called up was the one Uchiha Sasuke, who attempted to make a big show of his entrance, using a slightly chakra-enhanced jump to land just to the right of Mizuki. Normally, Naruto would have just walked up to the ring, but today Naruto was feeling slightly provocative and motioned over to Kiba, and handed him Kage's no Kara Toriki, under very careful instruction to only hold it for him, before he disappeared in a shunshin, reappearing to the left of Mizuki, and directly opposite of Sasuke, who he could tell was nothing less than pissed that Naruto knew something he didn't. Settling into the basic Hachidori hummingbird, kata that was favored by his father, and watching intently as Sasuke set himself in the standard Uchiha Intasputa interceptor stance, both boys eyed each other down, waiting for whistleblow from Mizuki. When Mizuki's arm fell, he wasn't even able to fully get the word Hajime begin out of his mouth before Sasuke shot off like a rocket, headed straight for Naruto, dropping off at the last second and slipping to the right, moving to hit the blonde from the flank. Although the Uchiha's style was built around the sharing and encountering, it still had several aspects of offense, and Sasuke was hell-bent on capitalizing on them. He tried not to let it show, but it annoyed him to no small amount that Naruto was constantly battling him for the metaphorical limelight in class, and these feelings had grown into a very large and deep rivalry which was largely one-sided, and only served to deepen whenever Naruto would show up in some aspect of the academy. By his logic, he would never be able to defeat and kill his brother if he wasn't the best in the class. The Uchiha were the superior clan of Konoha, and it was his duty as the last remaining loyal one to avenge his family's legacy. Unfortunately for the young Uchiha, Naruto had spent years training with one of the 3 legendary Sannin, and that man's speed was nothing to laugh at. So while he had never actually fought against the man while he was at full strength, his speed still completely dwarfed that of Sasuke. So when the Avenger charged at Naruto, he had no problem shifting his weight to the side, and then ducking under the boy's sweeping leg kick, before appearing inside Sasuke's card and delivering 3 quick strikes to his solar plexus which mushed the black-haired boy away, before pressing his attack. Following up and appearing at the right side of Sasuke in a mirrored motion of what he had attempted, Naruto delivered an additional couple strikes to Sasuke's throat, cheek, and shoulder, before retreating back and dropping low, sending a kick reminiscent of an uppercut into the young Uchiha's chin, while he braced himself against the ground with his forearm before righting himself and settling back into his ready stance. His suspicions had been confirmed. The Hachidori hummingbird style was based around speed and delivering high speed, low drag strikes and kicks to one's opponent, and the speed of the user enhanced the attack strength of the user. So if one were fast enough to get around their opponent's counters, they could easily deal massive damage before retreating back out beyond their opponent's range, of which the Uzumaki survivor had just given a textbook example. Naruto stood for a moment in his stance, still balancing on the balls of his feet, before Mizuki finally called the match upon realizing that the young Uchiha clan heir was not going standing up, having been knocked unconscious by the final crushing blow Naruto had delivered to his chin. Mizuki shook his head before calling over to one of the several resident medics that were on hand for sparring sessions, and after having them collect Sasuke, he called up the next matchup, one Hyuga Hinata against Shino. Naruto, having done his part and won his match, merely stepped down from the platform, nodding to Shino on his way, who said something to him along the lines of his victory being logical or something. Kiba grinned at his blonde-haired, blue-eyed pal and handed him his trademark sword back, laughing unashamedly as Naruto looked at him with a questioning look, and Shikamaru simply uttered how troublesome. The whole thing was as Choji continued to munch happily on his chips, which he always somehow had no matter how many bags he ate. Naruto, man, that was awesome. I think you kicked him so hard that he might have flown off of the pole that was stuck up his ass. Kiba once again broke out into laughter, to which Naruto began to join in at this point. Hell, he might as well have some fun, and he still had around 9 more months to spend at the academy anyways. Well, shit, Kiba, I figured he could use the help. It was stuck up there pretty damn far anyways. Hiruzen Sarutobi leant back up from his crystal ball, once again mentally thanking whatever deity had seen fit to grant him such a useful gift. He smiled to himself before opening up one of the drawers on his desk and retrieving his signature pipe and tobacco, lighting it with a small fire jutsu and puffing on it happily. It had been about 3 months since Naruto had returned to Konohagakure, and it seemed so far that he was doing splendidly. Aside from the young boy's, albeit clever, use of the Kage Bunshin, which at some point he would talk to the child about, but seeing as how it wasn't really having a negative on him would continue to allow it to happen, the young Uzumaki was keeping out of trouble for the most part. This was even particularly surprising, considering he had managed to con the somewhat elusive Mitarashi Anko into becoming his pseudo-sensei and sparring partner, a relationship which, as far as the old Hokage could tell, was mutually beneficial. Additionally, the child was making many friends in the academy, most notably the heirs of the Akamichi, Nara, and Yuzuka, who he seemed particularly fond of, and a Burame. All in all, Naruto seemed to be getting on quite happily in the village, even despite Jiraiya leaving the young man high and dry several months ago. Perhaps it was the tobacco talking, but maybe the Sandaime was worrying too much about the young Uzumaki heir. The kid seemed to be doing all right on his own, just fine after all. He'd let it all play out and see where it went. After all, when you get to be that late in life, you can't spend time worrying about every single thing in the world, or you'll have no time left to enjoy it. It had been nearly 3 months since Uzumaki Naruto had nearly been caught in the act of ditching but not ditching school at the academy, and although it had been a close call, he had decided to continue on sending his clones in his place, though they were under strict instructions to not fall asleep this time. So far, he hadn't had any other near misses where he would almost be caught, but this was also largely in part due to his obtaining a copy of the class schedule, which allowed him to know when he would actually have to be at the academy for various activities, such as a spar or some of the more taxing chakra control exercises that his clones simple couldn't handle. In this somewhat short time frame, Naruto himself had noticed himself growing as ninja in several ways. For example, his own chakra control showed the most drastic improvement, and after a liberal use of Kage Bunshin, which had quickly become his favorite training method, He could easily perform the tree walking and water walking exercises, and had gone on to take them a step further by being able to maintain each technique for a minimum of 2 hours while in combat. This last part of this technique was largely brought on by Anko, who he had assumed by this point only agreed to train with him only because she enjoyed using his rapidly healing body as a pincushion. He couldn't complain too much, though. For all the cuts and bruises that the snake summoner had given him, every time he trained with her, he found himself taking less and less hits, before finally, after many sessions, he had been able to land a solid blow on her. Naruto smiled to himself as he hid. That had been a great day in his opinion, and while the hit he had gotten on his pseudo-sensei didn't even do much damage, she had still be admittedly proud of him, and had even treated him to ramen afterward. Although Naruto would still and forever refer to her as his sadistic snake sensei, there was a certain term of endearment that came with the title, and he knew that while they were very different people, the two misjudged members of Konoha had built a strong rapport with each other, and formed a bond that would not easily be broken. In fact, Anko herself had realized this too, and had even found herself teaching the young blonde shinobi in training some of her own assassination and killing techniques. She was, after all, a torture and interrogation specialist, and for many years before joining T&I, had been a member of ANBU. It had worked out especially well for her, as many of her skills could be brought over and transferred from her first major area of work to where she now resided. The way she say it is that over the years she had managed to come up with and revolutionize many of the ways that infiltration and assassination was done, and she may as well pass some of them on. Despite who her former sensei was, she was every bit dedicated to Konohagakure. Naruto briefly closed his eyes, shaking his head ever so slightly and pulling himself from his thoughts. He was currently in the middle of a game of hide and hunt with his aforementioned sadistic sensei. Cursing lightly to himself, Naruto disappeared from his camouflaged location at the base of a large tree in a rapid shunshin, narrowly avoiding the multitude of shuriken that now littered the area where he had once stood. Spinning deftly on his heel and unsheathing his Kage no Karatoriki in a swift and fluid motion, brought it to bear, parrying away several more kunai before jumping backwards and spinning on an axis, forming several one-handed seals and barking out a quick and controlled Futen, Diatapa Wind Release, Great Breakthrough, which served its elected purpose of spinning the remaining kunai into disarray. Landing back on the ground, Naruto sprinted forward, pulsing his chakra as he did so, jumping forwards but angling himself sideways, slimming his body to fall in between the two Fuuma shuriken that had been launched at him from either side, before launching himself into the air, watching with some satisfaction as the ground below him liquefied, and then solidified soon after, signifying Anko's use of the same trapping technique she had used on him in their first spar. Finding himself on a nearby tree branch, Naruto pulsed his chakra, in a gross and unrefined form of the chakra Hankyoyute no Jutsu, chakra echolocation jutsu, and immediately launched himself off of the tree he had been on, flying towards the now revealed Anko, who simply grinned up at him, laughing as she dropped a kunai into each hand before bringing them up into a standardized ANBU cross block, before trapping the young blonde's blade down into the ground. Using the angle to spin her left up and over, kicking out at Naruto and nailing him in the neck, smiling as he flew to the side, impacting the ground a short distance away. Her victory was short-lived, however, as the Naruto on the exploded as soon as she neared to check on him, in a clever use of Bunshin Deibuka, Great Clone Explosion, almost throwing her back had she not noticed at the last second, before raising both arms and allowing the snakes hidden within her sleeves, easily catching the sword-carrying arm of each swordsman, watching with mild satisfaction as her pets bit into each one, dispelling the clones. However, once again her victory was short-lived, as what she sincerely hoped was the real Naruto dropping down from above her, falling through the smokescreen created by his clones, clutching what appeared to be a small blue ball of energy in his hand, aimed directly for Anko's head as she looked up and feigned surprised at his entrance, which quickly morphed into actual surprise as she noticed the very recognizable Rasengan thrust outwards. Naruto grinned. This was finally it. He smiled all the way to the ground, and his grin only subsided once the surrounding ground was obliterated from his technique's impact. He barely had time to stand, barely bringing his katana to bear over his left shoulder, blocking an irate-looking Anko armed with kunai, but unfortunately failed to notice that the real Anko was underneath the ground, and him up until the point he felt her hands wrap around his ankles, pulling him neck deep into the ground, sword and all. Really, kid? A fucking Rasengan. I knew you were the fourth brat, but damn. Maybe I should stop holding back on you. The Mitarashi mused to herself, tapping her chin thoughtfully as she knelt down in front of the trapped Uzumaki. Naruto, for his part, was doing his absolute best not to look at the view he was being blatantly given by the snake Kunoichi, knowing that the moment he allowed the blush onto his face of attempted to sneak a peek, he would be in a world of hurt. Kami, Anko-sensei, you get mad if I don't have intent to kill, you get mad when I do try to kill you. I don't understand. Naruto sighed exasperatedly, looking his pseudo-sensei dead in the eyes. Can you please just let me up? This position isn't exactly comfortable, and I do have other things to do today. Naruto trailed off at that point, looking up expectantly at the snake summoner, as was finally rewarded as the ground around him loosened up to the point that he was able to move, and he pulled himself out of the dirt sheathing his katana and replacing it on his shoulders. Thanking his friend and sensei, Naruto took to the trees, moving in, between them in a combination of shunshin and basic tree hopping. As he disappeared through the rooftops, Anko remained on the forest floor, watching him go, not even blinking when a single ANBU operative dropped down next to her. She waited a mere few moments before inclining her head towards the crane-masked man, speaking softly. You know, he's improved a lot in the last few months. His speed has improved. Taijutsu is up, his ninjutsu was already above his level, and one of these days I think I'll talk to Yugao and have her mess him up in kenjutsu. Not to mention that Rasengan in the end there. He's gotten decent at his misdirection tactics as well. She informed the other shinobi, who only nodded and retrieved a scroll from his pack, handing it to the T&I operator, who began to briefly look it over. Am I to assume, then, that he has your recommendation for the Corps? The recommendation of someone such as yourself wouldn't be overlooked should he accept our offer once he becomes a genin. The ANBU supplied, his features a mask due to his mask, and his stature offered no inclinations to what he may have actually been thinking. Anko had finished looking over the scroll and held her hand over it, pushing some of her chakra into her signature and sealing her recommendation into the paper before handing it back to the other ninja. Yeah, I approve of the decision, and I give my recommendation and back for Uzumaki Naruto to be instated into the Konoha ANBU division yada yada whatever. The kid's got my backing. That's all you're really looking for, right, Crane? Anko tilted her head back and turned to look at her fellow shinobi before addressing him once more, stopping him as he was about to leave the clearing. Just make sure to give him something other than the fox mask, all right. As Crane left the clearing, he could still make out the, in his opinion, slightly insane snake summoner's laughter. Sighing to himself, the ANBU operative made his way through the trees and eventually through the rooftops of Konoha back to his headquarters. The young Uzumaki had been approved for eligibility to enter the ANBU Corps, pending his graduation from the academy. As he landed in the doorway of the hidden entrance and checked his surroundings before entering, he verified that he had all the information that was required on the boy. Soon, if he accepted, the heir to the Uzumaki would become the newest member of the Black Ops Division. It had been nearly a year since Naruto had signed up at the academy, and to say that things were going swimmingly was an understatement. He had easily rose to the top of his class, only having the occasional rival in the form of the brooding Uchiha, who, despite Naruto's best efforts, refused to lighten his mood, causing him to eventually give up trying. Instead, he had chosen to become closer to the many friends he had made and found a way to bond with each of them. It wasn't an uncommon sight to find him sleeping outside with Shikamaru or chowing down on a bag of chips with Chouji. But if he had to choose, he had become closest of all to the young and Uzuka heir, Kiba. The two boys would often train together, and though Naruto had supremely outclassed him, it only served to push him on to train harder, and every time the boys would part it was on good terms. It was a common sight to see the two heirs leaning on each other on their way back from the training grounds, barely standing from exhaustion, and there were many nights that the last Uzumaki simply passed out at Kiba's, unable to move. If anyone ever asked him, he would say that he would prefer to live on his own and said that he enjoyed the solitude, but it was obvious to everyone in the compound, especially Tsume and Hana, who had both become quite fond of him, often calling him an honorary Inuzuka, that he adored the affection and attention he would get there. In fact, this is actually where he was coming from, having stayed the night over at the Inuzuka compound, having been invited over there the night prior by Kiba. The two had been training non-stop for the entire night before, apart from one incident where an unassuming Naruto walked in on a showering Hana blushing and nearly passing out from a nosebleed. their reason being that today was the day for the yearly final exams. When the academy had been completely overhauled many years ago, a few systems had been put in place to assist those who were above the average skill level into getting out into the ninja force sooner, rather than doing the standard 3 years at the academy. One such program was the yearly final exam, which, if passed with a high enough mark, allowed the student to graduate early and be granted the rank of Genin. Typically, only third-year student attempted to take the exam, but after enough prodding and recommendations from his various sensei, Naruto had relented, and today both he and Kiba would be taking the test, hopefully passing with a high enough rating and becoming the village's newest Genin. Naruto knew he was ready, something about being trained personally by one of the Sannin, and then finding a sparring partner in the form of the student of another one did wonders to boost the young boy's confidence. As Naruto walked through the door of his classroom, Kiba and Akamaru, in tow he was nothing but a beacon of confidence and self-trust. It wasn't long before Uruka entered the room and began calling names back, eventually calling Naruto himself back into the exam room. The written exam portion was up first, and he easily managed to pass it with flying colors, even the portion on ninjutsu theory, as well as the section that consisted on almost nothing but the properties and ratio distributions of chakra. Following up the test was a physical evaluation, which was more of a checkup than anything else, and then a spar against one of the Chunin proctors. Naruto was lucky in this portion of the evaluation, and thanks to his more recent training from Anko, was able to dispatch Mizuki within a matter of minutes, ending the match with his blade pointed at the older man's throat. The final portion, ninjutsu, was the easiest by far, and after Naruto easily performed the henge, he overloaded the bunshin and made 20 instead of the required 3, and a basic kawarimi. He proudly walked out of the room, a leaf inscribed Hidai-ite clutched in his hand, and a broad smile on his face. The newest genin of the leaf walked happily down the street, the badge of his stature tied loosely around his waist, reminiscent of a certain smoking Sarutobi and his 12 shinobi guardian sash. The blonde in question was currently on his way to the Ikaraku ramen stand, completely intent on celebrating his new rank with the owners of the stands, and later with his friends. Unfortunately, out of all the students in his former class, he had been the only one to pass the exam with a high enough mark to become a genin. Some honorable mentions, of course, would be Sasuke, who had actually only missed the mark by a mere 10 points, and Kiba, who although had poured his heart and soul into his training, had missed the minimum required score by a margin of 15. The young Inuzuka hadn't harbored any ill will towards him, though, and was actually quite happy for his friend. This couldn't be said for the brooding Uchiha, though, who had never actually bonded with Naruto, and now after being shown up once more, harbored a resentment that was resolute in its stance. There would be no peace between Uchiha and Uzumaki as far as he was concerned. The Uzumaki clan heir walked into the ramen stand, and after the subsequent congratulatory hug and a complimentary bowl of his favorite miso ramen, he was soon digging into his second bowl, happily slurping down the broth. However, it was as he lowered the bowl from his face that he noticed that the once empty seat to the right of him was now filled with the small, lithe form of a kunoichi, dressed in the typical white, gray, and black ANBU garb, her cat mask doing nothing to conceal her long, flowing violet hair. Naruto did his best not to look surprised, although the operative had caught him completely off guard. It was then that Naruto noticed that the ramen stand itself was quiet, quieter than usual. He couldn't even hear old man Tuchai cooking in the back, and Ayame was nowhere to be found. Swallowing the last of the broth, the Uzumaki heir turned his head towards the cat-masked shinobi sitting next to him, idly noticing the katana strapped to her back, as her emotionless mask stared right back at him. Uzumaki Naruto, a message from Lord Danzo. With that short and quick affirmation, the ninja retrieved a scroll from the pouch on her right hip, before handing it to Naruto, and after verifying that he did indeed recognize its importance, she vanished in a shunshin, the ramen stand seemingly returning to life as the last leaf petals hit the ground from Cat's quick exit. Contemplating the scroll in his hands, Naruto apologized to Ayame, who had by now reappeared, being none the wiser to what had happened, paid his tab, and disappeared in a shunshin of his own, reappearing on the top of the Hokage monument before moving to stand on his father's head. Holding the scroll in his hand, he opened it, reading quickly and eyes going wide. Soon after he finished, per instruction on the scroll, Naruto channeled a small fire jutsu between his fingers, burning the paper in his hands to ash. He had a week to make his decision like he actually needed it. For him, the decision was already made. All he had to do now was act on it. The strange, three-pronged kunai sailed through the air in straight line that was polished off from years of practice, impacting into the target, not only dead center, but with a hearty thunk, before it was enshrouded by a dark yellow flash of light. Anyone who had been alive when the Yondaime Hokage had been would have immediately recognized the signature jutsu of Namikaze Minato, but they would also have been quite thrown off, as instead of the man they had envisioned appearing, they would have watched the small frame of a 12-year-old slam into the tree, unable to control his momentum. Naruto had been attempting to master his father's Hurricane technique for the last several months, and with this being his first, and also last, week as a Genin before he officially signed on with ANBU, he wanted to be able to make as much progress as he possibly could before he started with the core. For all the progress he had made on the Hurricane, though, he was still a long ways off from where his father had been. Just thinking about the shoes he had to fill to live up to his father's name was enough to make his head spin. The man had been a legend, able to decimate entire armies within minutes. And if Naruto wanted to surpass him, he had a long way to go. That isn't to say that he hadn't made progress, though. His first attempts at utilizing the Hurricane had ended in nothing more than him throwing an oddly shaped kunai against a wall. After going over the notes left by his father, though, he had been able to rewrite the seals on the various kunai to a new formula that was suited for him, as the jutsu was orientated around a complex sealing array, and it had nothing to do with being of the same blood as the original user. Over the next few months, Naruto had made some outstanding progress, eventually getting to the point where he was able to flash to each kunai, but only after doing the appropriate hand seals for the Hurricane. And although he was steadily making progress towards being able to use it seamlessly, and by instinct like his father had been able to, he was still a long ways off from surpassing what was arguably the jutsu that ended the Third Shinobi World War. Naruto picked himself back up from the ground, and in a spout of anger channeled his chakra into a particularly anger and frustration-fueled Rasengan, driving it into the target, obliterating it, and sending the splinters flying everywhere. Sighing to himself, the Uzumaki picked up the now split in half tri-pronged kunai, before scowling and flinging it away from him, making his way back towards the far end of the training field where he had a literal pile of the kunai, just adjacent to a few small groups of clones who had been training on other, less physically dangerous, aspects. You keep destroying targets like that and Konoha might run out one of these days. A voice lazily drawled out, startling Naruto out of his musings, the young man spinning and closing his right hand around the hilt of Kage's no Kara Toriki, but loosening his hold once he realized it was only Anko. Sighing, he absent-mindedly threw one of the offending kunai at her, which she easily caught and began spinning around her finger. "I heard you accepted the ANBU contract," she began, holding back her amused chuckle at his look of surprise. "Who told you about that? I thought that was supposed to be classified. I haven't even told anyone." The blonde started, lazily dodging the kunai as it came sailing back towards him, noting with mild interest that it landed back in the pile of its brothers. "Oh, please, kid, who do you think recommended you to the Corps in the first place, or gave their personal recommendation as well?" "I'm part of the reason that you got selected, Naruto," Anko informed him, smiling cheekily and flashing a toothy grin as she walked towards him, grabbing the young man in a light headlock, playfully roughing up his head as she did so. "Really? Oh, Anko-chan, I knew you had a heart." It was just hidden behind all that anger and hate. Naruto barbed back at her, substituting himself with a log and effectively escaping Anko's playful assault. Laughing at her bewildered face, he laughed. "You were the one who taught me the way of the log, Anko-chan. For when you feel the tug on your soul, you shall know that it is the will of the log. Allow yourself to swap with it, and for a brief moment, you and the log shall become one." He quoted back at her, remembering a time when she had first used the Kawarimi no Jutsu in one of their spars, and then proceeded to beat the following log worship into his head. Allowing her face to slip into a devilish grin that reached all the way to her ears, Anko fell into her practiced hebai, snake, stance, fully intent on placing the young Genin and ANBU into a tight spot. "Oh, it's Anko-chan now, huh? Well then, Naruto-kun, maybe I should reserve us a room." She trailed off as she disappeared into a burst of speed, reappearing directly in front of him and throwing a sweeping round punch as she began the taijutsu match. For the next several hours, the various sounds of combat could be heard coming from the Namikaze estate. The Uzumaki clan knelt in the shadows of the small, torch-lit room. It was dry, yet somewhat musty at the same time, but also held the unmistakable air of a practiced military installation that was only enhanced by the dull gray paint and black Konoha flags. Standing at the head of the room and flanked on either side by a standard ANBU agent was a man whose clothing was covered by the unusually black ANBU cloak. However, the cloak did nothing to cover the man's bandaged face or spiked black hair. The cloak also revealed that the man's right arm was trapped in a sling, and if one were to judge by the man's ever-present cane, he was also someone injured, if not just elderly. However, none of these qualities did anything to mask the man's confident aura, and he practically leaked an air of exuberance. The man, known as Shimura Danzo, head of Kano Hagakure's Black Ops Division, and whose orders were only superseded by the Hokage himself, moved to stand in front of the kneeling blonde, asking the first and only question that all ANBU initiates faced. "Do you know why you were selected to kneel before the great tree of Konoha?" Naruto, not moving anything but his lips, answered solemnly, but no less resolutely. "To walk in the shadows that even ninja fear to tread, I will protect my village from the darkness by harnessing myself, defending it with my life and soul." At this completion of his statement, the tile plating on the ground in front of Naruto opened up, revealing a raising platform upon which rested a white porcelain mask containing the visage of a lynx. "Then rise and go forth. Tonight, you are no longer Uzumaki Naruto, heir to the Uzumaki clan and Genin of Konoha. Until the day that you step from the shadows and return to the light, you shall be known as Rinkusu Lynx." Placing the mask upon his face, Lynx stood up, for what felt like the first time, before closing his right hand into a fist and crossing it over his heart. "I am no longer Uzumaki Naruto, I am Lynx." Danzo merely nodded once, before spinning on his heel, walking out of the room, as the newly appointed Lynx stood in the room at attention. "The Nine-Tails Jinchuriki is now under my command," the old war hawk mused to himself as he left the room, not even bothering to turn as one of his captains passed by him in the hallway, heading to meet her new charge. Lynx, perhaps because of the mask, or maybe he was already that steeled in his emotions, didn't even move when the ANBU operative he had met before, Cat, stepped into the room, quickly crossing it to get face-to-face with him before speaking in a curtly and clipped tone. "Lynx, I am Cat, your new captain. From this point on, your chain of command is me and only me. Is that clear?" Waiting for a brief second as Lynx nodded, she continued, "Very well. Then after we set you up in your new living quarters, we'll see about getting you in the field. Let's move." Kat smiled pleasantly behind her mask at the obedient and seemingly capable nature of her newest recruit. Soon she would see just what Anko had when she had pushed for the young blonde to join the corps, and as she turned on her heel and began walking away, with Lynx in tow, she couldn't help but hope he didn't disappoint her. She'd hate to be the one to break it to Anko that her prodigal son, in the Kunoichi's own words, had died on his first mission as an agent. Lynx sat stock still in the tree, trusting fully in the light-bending camouflage jutsu that he had been taught by Jirgya, watching intently at the scene unfolding below him. Lynx had been a member of ANBU for several weeks now, and after blasting through the standard recruit training that typically took an agent a period of 1 month, Lynx completed it in 1 week, thank you Kage Bunshin. He had been assigned his first of many missions. So far, he even had a perfect track record, spanning multiple missions throughout various areas of the elemental nations. Currently, he was watching as one of the nobles of Rice Country and his entourage passed by his position. He had been assigned to eliminate this particular noble, a woman in her early 20s. Lynx didn't know how such a low-profile assassination would help his village, but then again, he wasn't supposed to. As an agent, Lynx was a tool to be used as his captain and his Hokage saw fit. If that meant dispatching a 3-man cell to deal with an up-and-coming noble, then that's what it meant. If his face showed any sort of disapproval of this mission, his mask did not relay it. Lynx's mind was pulled from his musings as he saw a single kunai knife impact dead center on the noble's carriage, the attached flashbang blinding the 2 Chunin in the front, and allowing his teammate, Raven, to drop in between the two, driving a kunai into each man's neck before speeding towards the chariot itself. Meanwhile, Lynx had shunshin to behind the Chunin that was bringing up the rear, before spinning on his heel and moving in a burst of incredible speed towards the chariot as well, K's no Karatoriki out and extended. As he passed the ninja on his way to the chariot, flicking his katana forward, the man was dead and decapitated before he even hit the ground. All at the same time as the jounin of the group emerged from inside the carriage, laying an eye on Naruto before a short, black tanto appeared to protrude from his back to the front of his chest. As the man fell over, the small form of Jaguar appeared behind the man, nodding at Lynx. As one, the three members of ANBU each took a side on the chariot, before running through a set of hand seals and with a simultaneous call of Katen. Gakakyu no Jutsu, fire release, great fireball jutsu. The three large balls of highly corrosive heat and energy collided in on each other, rendering the small carriage and the noble inside to dust. Performing a swift, Futen, Datapa wind style, great breakthrough, which cleared away all of the ash that had accumulated between the bodies and destroyed wood, leaving a cleared road that had little to no evidence of anything that had occurred there. Lynx spared the scene one more glance before he took to the trees, relying on his already incredible speed to catch his teammates. ANBU operatives were supposed to be discreet, after all. And after the noble was killed and all the evidence destroyed, Lynx supervised the cleanup before our return to Konoha. Raven reported to Cat, all three members of his cell remaining kneeling before the cat-masked woman. "Very well, you are dismissed to quarters until further instruction. Lynx, Cat spoke in a clipped tone, her arms crossed under her decently sized bust, walking around the still kneeling Lynx. He watched her as she paced around him, not moving his head but still taking in every aspect her curves. He may have been young, but he was still a guy. He remained frozen as she moved around behind him, stopping as she became perpendicular to the sword that was crossed across the young man's back. "Training ground beta, 2 minutes, don't be late." Kat simply stated, turning her back, and hearing the slightly distorted and muffled, "Yes, Teichu," before the small gust of wind that was common with a shunshin. She grinned to herself under her mask, fingering her own katana before pulling up her hand and vanishing in a shunshin of her own, small leaf petals floating softly down and landing on her desk. So her newest recruit fancied himself to be good at kenjutsu. Maybe she could have some fun with him, after all. And by fun, she very obviously meant brutalized through her own mastery of kenjutsu. Lynx had no idea that she was known as Konoha's mistress of the blade, but he would soon learn. And learn he did. As soon as his captain had shown up, there had never been any warning. He had been standing down at the far end of the designated beta, training ground of the ANBU, and the few other members that had been there quickly vacated as soon as Cat appeared on the other end, facing towards Lynx. Inclining his head in an unassuming, questioning look, Lynx was barely able to slide out of the way as Cat appeared inside his guard, a downward sword slash already in motion. It was all he could do to sidestep, rolling to the side, and drawing his own katana to block the follow-up strike from his captain. The following hour, Cat would show exactly why she was a captain in the ANBU Corps, and her title was aptly earned, as no matter what the young agent would try, he was promptly beaten down. Kage bunshin, various ninjutsu, hell, he even tried a couple sealing techniques on her, which while he may have been able to catch her off guard once or twice, he was only able to land a single definitive hit right at the end of the session, which is why the spar, if it could be called that, was called to a close. Through an interesting strategy, Lynx showed his true prowess in tactics when he managed to slice open Cat's thigh. She had just finished up a near-crushing combination of kenjutsu and taijutsu on him, culminating in her kicking him straight into the air, before allowing him to drop onto her blade. However, at the last second, Lynx sprung his plan into action, and although his body was completely wrecked, he was able to hold together long enough to complete it. As the young agent fell towards the sword, he pulsed his chakra outward, and multiple rocks and rubble around that had become littered around the training field released their transformation techniques, revealing themselves to be multiple copies of Lynx, all who promptly launched themselves at the ANBU captain. To her merit, the captain didn't miss a beat, merely abandoning skewering the agent and opting to rage through his clones, quickly making short work of them. As she disarmed and speared the last one with her own katana, she spun to face her newest charge, but right as she raised her sword to begin her assault, she noticed a small glint in the corner of her vision. Before she had any more time to react, the original Lynx yanked back hard on all of the ninja wire that littered the area, seemingly trapping his captain in a spider web of wire, making her look similar to a trapped fly inside said web. His trap wasn't done yet, though, for as soon as Cat began to cut her way free of the many cords that had attached to her, she was able to hear the multitude of hissing noises, as the myriad of paper bombs he had attached to the wires exploded, enshrouding the area in a flash of light. This still wasn't enough to take down, or even faze the ANBU captain, as she jumped out of the cloud of smoke, seemingly unfazed by the assault that had befuddled her. However, at that exact moment, 4 separate lynxes appeared on either side of her, Rasengan in hand, and made a dash at her, which she was able to avoid by dropping low and spinning, eliminating all that had surrounded her. What caught her off guard, though, is that the sword that one of the clones dropped did not pop out of existence like the rest, and when she spun to look at the falling blade, Lynx burst from the ground directly below her, grabbing his sword as it fell, and managed to slice Cat clean across her outer thigh as she desperately backtracked, dodging the brunt of his blow and promptly kicking him hard across the back, sending him flying across the clearing. Cat stood there and watched as Lynx slowly got shakily to his feet, and though he couldn't see it, she narrowed her eyes but also raised one of her eyebrows in mild surprise. It had been a while since such a fresh member had been able to land a hit on her, and although the cut he had delivered was nothing to write home about, it was still a definite hit on an ANBU captain. Cat had to hand it to Anko. She sure knew how to pick him. Cat waited until Lynx was fully back on his feet before addressing him for the last time that day. "You're dismissed for the day. Unless missions send you otherwise, you will report to here, and to me every other day, bar nothing, at 1800. Am I clear?" She turned and began her shunshin away, easily catching the clear Teichu. That drifted over to her on the wind. Lynx, now standing on sore legs with a sheathed K's no Karatoriki in hand, began his slow limp off of the training field. He was going to murder Anko if he made it out of ANBU. There was a lot you could learn about someone by the way that they fought. The way that one throws their fists, which advantages they will and won't use, the weapons they choose to employ, and the strategies that they employ all give a great deal on insight into not only that person's character, but also their philosophy and mindset. This saying, however true it may have been, absolutely went double for those who chose to use swords as one of the baselines for their own personal fighting style. If one were to sit and not just watch, but truly observe a battle between two kenjutsu masters, they would be awestruck by the sheer tenacity alone of the combat. When two masters of the blade meet, their joining and crossing of blades is often referred to and seen as a dance between the two combatants, their blades ebbing and flowing with each other, each one performing a give and take, and the moment both rapid and fluid. It was truly a masterpiece to behold if one were privileged enough to watch them meet. That is, if the battle itself wasn't decided within the first few strikes. Conversely, though, the longer the meeting between the two swordsmen went on, the danger of it also went up, as each opponent would be more and more willing to pull out all the stops and go for the more dangerous maneuvers. This was both a boon and a disappointment for any spectator, as some of the sheer movements that would be made are absolutely astounding, but they were also more likely to bring a quick and decisive end to the dance, almost as if the music they had been flowing to had been cut, the record being smashed. However, none of these thoughts were farther from Lynx's mind as he desperately parried, dodged, and counterstroke against the blade of his captain, the ever-elusive cat-masked ANBU, who he had come to realize was a world-class kenjutsu expert. It seemed to matter little how much he trained or how much he fought against her, for every single time they would engage in a fight, she had walked away the victor. That isn't to say that Lynx was a slouch. He was just simply outclassed when it came to strict kenjutsu. He had proven multiple times that when all the restrictions placed upon him were released, that he could be a brilliant tactician that rivaled that of Hade Kakashi himself, and combined with his already massive and versatile ninjutsu arsenal, and the simple fact that with his mastery of the Kage Bunshin he was a literal one-man army, Lynx was truly a one-man army. Unfortunately, none of that particularly mattered at the moment, as for the last several spars, if he could call them that, after having slowly and painfully limped away after more than one of their sessions, his captain had ordered him to use nothing but his kenjutsu and taijutsu, effectively handicapping a great deal to the point of being crippled. However, Lynx had been no slouch in learning and adapting his kenjutsu style, and his preferred style of taijutsu, while mostly aimed around the benefit of his various speed-enhancing techniques, was still good in a pinch. He knew what Cat had been trying to do, though, and he appreciated it to an extent. However, after nearly 2 years of being in the ANBU Corps, during which time he had spent every other day when he wasn't out of the village on assignment being brutalized by his captain, he was beginning to tire of it. As Lynx dropped his weight, by now easily slipping under Cat's outstretched katana, he leaned back before bringing his right hand up hard and fast, striking the back of Cat's elbow and knocking her sword out of her hand, sending it spinning into the air. Grinning beneath his mask, Lynx brought his sword to bear, spinning on his heel after righting himself, and bringing his blade around in a feinting shoulder strike, before reversing the blade and moving it towards her throat. As she had been disarmed, and without a weapon, Lynx was caught off guard when his captain brought her hand upwards in a flash, deflecting the intruding blade with a flick of her wrist, before firmly planting her foot into his solar plexus, at the same time as she rotated her over and around his wrist, grabbing it and slamming it down as the rest of his body attempted to fly away. The resulting torque dislocated the man's wrist and forced him to let go of his blade, the fallen Kage's no Karatoriki clattering to the ground as Kat released his hand, caught her sword and brought its point to bear on the fallen man's neck. Knowing that he had now was of knowing it, Kat smiled behind her porcelain mask, fully allowing the ear-splitting grin to take over his visage. The 14-year-old agent had been steadily improving at an alarming rate in almost all aspects of the ninja, lacking only in genjutsu to the point that she doubted that he would ever be able to cast anything other than a C-rank technique. While she knew that the younger blonde could greatly appreciate his alarming growth to his liberal use of Kage Bunshin, his tenacity was also something that wasn't to be scoffed at. You could look at his outlook on her training as a prime example of this, as no matter how many times she beat him down, broke his bones, shattered his libs, or just generally cut him up during their spars, she knew Lynx would be at training field beta the day after, despite the shape he was in. Additionally, Lynx also boasted a currently 100% mission success rate, with minor casualties having been suffered only a small number of times. Yes, all in all, even Kat had to admit that he was a truly impressive ANBU agent, having only been in the program 2 years, and ascending to the position that he was in was something that had been unheard of since the days of Uchiha Itachi. There were many reasons that Kat had chosen to make him her lieutenant nearly a year ago, but one of the largest was the young man's drive that even she could see was barely concealed behind his mask. This did nothing to mention the sheer potential that the young man possessed. His room for growth was massive, and the teen seemed to take to the ninja arts akin to a fish taking to water. All of these thoughts flashed through the ANBU captain's mind as she flicked the blood from her katana before sheathing her blade, turning her back on her lieutenant and walking away, disappearing in a rapid shunshin. As Lynx slowly picked himself up, he knew he was being watched by several members of ANBU if their somewhat familiar chakra signatures were anything to go off of. While he was no censor, even he could pick up people this close in proximity to his own massive chakra. What he didn't know, though, was that the few watching him were some of the other captains of the other divisions in the Corps, and he was clueless to the fact that Kat had been looking for a replacement. No, all Lynx knew for sure was that his wrist needed to be reset, and that he was in a hell of a lot of pain for it being this early in the morning. He sighed softly to himself, before retrieving his fallen katana and returning it to the sheath on his back. At least he didn't have any missions planned for the next couple days, so he could attempt to recuperate before his next beat-out raining. He meant training. Sarutobi Hiruzen looked at the stack of paperwork laid out in front of him, idly wondering just exactly how much trouble he could possibly get in by burning it all to a crisp. It wouldn't take much, not even a second thought. The professor could simply flick his fingers, and in the small flash of a fire jutsu, it would all be gone. The old man sighed, staying his hand for now. The paperwork was a necessary evil that was in place to help run the village, and while he hated it with almost every fiber of his being, he was mature enough to restrain himself. Looking over to the dude standing in front of him, Sarutobi steeled himself, his visage taking on that of a hardened warrior, that of a straight commander, rotating his chair to face the 3-man cell that was keeling in front of him, their animal-masked faces bowed respectfully towards the ground. Hiruzen smiled briefly, instantly recognizing the young man on bowed on the far left, his mop of unruly dull blonde hair being a dead giveaway for one as attentive as the Hokage. Returning his thoughts to the matter at hand, the old Hokage addressed the 3 ANBU agents in the room, allowing them to stand at full height as he began his briefing. Lynx, Tiger, Boar, you 3 have been gathered based off of your specific qualities that will be essential to this mission. Recently, a team of Genin that was operating within the Land of Fire stumbled upon what appears to be one of the bases of my old student, Orochimaru. As it is highly unlikely that he is still in the vicinity, your team's mission is to infiltrate the facility and retrieve any documents or envoys of interest that remain. This is to include personnel that may have been left behind. Lynx has operational command, and you are to leave promptly. I expect a full debrief upon completion. The man raised his head after ensuring that Lynx had gleaned all the information he needed to from the folder containing all they had learned of the outpost, before burning it with a fire jutsu between his fingertips. As always, if you are captured or killed, the leaf will immediately disavow you from the ANBU core, and while an effort will be made to retrieve you, we will not expend undue resources. Any questions? The Hawkage paused for a brief second, making sure to catch the eye of each member of the team, linger on the cold blue eyes of Lynx for a moment before speaking once more, rising and turning his back to the three men, grasping his hands firmly behind his back. Dismissed. The three-man cell immediately phased out of the office, each vanishing in their own form of shunshin, before reappearing in the central command area of the ANBU headquarters. The two subordinate members looked to the de facto leader of their newly minted task force as he addressed them for the first time. "We leave in 15 minutes. Prepare for close combat and personnel capture. If there are any, I want them alive and in good condition. Pack light, pack fast. South gate on my previous mark, move." Lynx watched as his team vanished off to gather their own respective gear, before rushing off to obtain his own. Lynx was no stranger to the burden of leadership, having been in the position a decent amount of times ever since his promotion to lieutenant of the 7th Division within ANBU. However, this would be the first time he was the lead agent on the raid of such a high-profile target. For his team, though, he would be the picture of confidence. It simply wouldn't do to be the lone, unconfident leader. Plus, Lynx knew that Bohr himself was actually a captain himself, so why he had been granted operational command over his superior officer, he had no idea. Unfortunately, he had no time to lament on it, as he had just arrived at the gate, moments late joined by the aforementioned captain, and seconds after that, Tiger. Nodding to his team, Lynx jumped into the trees, speeding off due south, his team hot on his heels. The three-man task force arrived at the entrance to a large cave system in the southwestern region of Fire Country, near the border with River Country. Seeing as how the base was a part of such a complex system, it was no wonder that it had remained unseen until now, even being in Fire Country. Dropping to the ground below the tree he was currently in, Lynx was soon joined by Bohr and Tiger, and upon relaying to them their instructions, the three seemed to vanish as they moved akin to snakes in the grass towards the entrance of the cave complex, slipping inside unseen and unheard. They hadn't made it too far into the system before they discovered the true entrance to the compound, in the form of a small, circular door on the far side of one of the walls. As Lynx moved to disable the various seals that had crisscrossed over the hatch, his two teammates covered his approach. It was somewhat well known in the ANBU Corps that Lynx was quite adept with the lost art of fuinjutsu, and it was speculated within the higher echelons that he had long surpassed even Jirya in the art. As the two men watched their team leader work, precisely and in silence, they were reminded of the reason he had been placed on his team. The way that the current ANBU lineup worked was that each member of the team served a particular role. For example, if the mission parameters were more suited for heavy combat, a group of combat and ninjutsu specialists would be sent over a team of capture and interrogation proficient agents. For this particular raid, the team consisted of Lynx, the SEAL expert and close-to-mid combat specialist, in addition to Tiger, the infiltration and intelligence gathering expert, who would know what to look for as they moved through the base. And finally, the team was rounded out by Bohr, who, as a captain, was proficient in all areas to a certain extent, but in this case served primarily for prisoner capture and interrogation. Lynx finished writing out the kanji he had been working on, before lightly pressing the paper into the center of the doorway, watching as the seal he had written briefly flashed a dull blue, followed by the door opening, the many security and defense seals the littered the entranced now nullified. Signaling to the other two members of his raid group, Lynx stepped inside the compound. However, for all his training, Lynx was only slightly surprised that the inside of the complex was built like a maze, with corridors and tunnels spiraling off in several directions. Signaling once again to his teammates, Lynx quickly formed a massive group of Kage Bunshin, them all immediately rushing off in separate directions, as the team of three stepped into the shadows, waiting for the reconnaissance group that had just been sent out to return. They didn't have to wait for long, as within 7 minutes of the Kage Bunshin's disappearance, all of them had been dispelled, and Lynx now knew the correct path to follow to the main facility, and as far as he could tell, there weren't very many combatants in the hall, if at all. Only 4 of his clones had been forcefully dispelled after reaching what he perceived as the main chamber, the rest of the clones dispelling on their own after reaching nothing of value or hitting a dead end in the compound. In response, the three agents quickly made their way down the long halls of the facility before coming up to the door that led to the main area. The team stacked up on it, with Tiger and Boar on either side, Lynx standing center on the ceiling a few feet back. After assuming that they had already been discovered by way of Lynx's destroyed clones, the team opted for the shock-and-awe approach. Boar and Tiger, after slapping a pair of enhanced explosive tags on the door, jumped back and took cover, looking on in mild satisfaction as the doors were blown inwards, and the team idly watched as a massive hail of kunai and shuriken peppered the area where the door had once stood. "Well, go ahead and come on out, shitheads. I ain't got all fucking day." A feminine voice perforated the darkness of the complex, and the Konoha team began quickly signing to each other in preparation for the contact with the enemy. In seconds, it had been decided that Lynx, as the combat specialist, would distract and deal with the enemy, allowing Boar and Tiger to slip past and continue on with the mission. "Jesus fucking Christ, I know you're there, stop being a fucking puss." The woman started before a single kunai pierced the darkness, heading towards her, its aim based entirely off of the sound of her voice. As the enemy combatant easily sidestepped the lone kunai, smirking at the stupidity of such an attack, she was caught off guard as it was suddenly replaced with the 5'4" form of what she assumed was a young man, if his somewhat muscled frame was anything to go by as he appeared next to him, throwing a spinning kick that managed to connect with her solar plexus, sending her to the other side of the room. Lynx fell into his tried and true Hachidori, hummingbird stance, a kunai easily falling into his right hand in a reverse grip as he appraised his female opponent. It was hard for him to fully see in the low lighting, but the woman was dressed in what appeared to be a gray battle dress, with black compression shorts and a matching top underneath, held together at her waist by a large, purple rope that served as a belt. She was also wearing some sort of headband that covered the top of her head, slipping her long red hair down either side of her head with a small tuft stuck down the center, lying flat on her nose. Hell, Lynx may have even thought the woman was cute, had she not been trying to kill him and his team. By the time he had finished his appraisal of his opponent, the woman had already got to her feet, screaming something about being one of her Orochimaru-sama's elite, left in charge of the facility as they pulled out. But if he was being honest with himself, Lynx couldn't have cared less about her name, rank, or whatever. That was Morno Ibuki's job to find out, and he would ensure he was able to. Forming some Kage Bunshin, which quickly jumped into the shadows of the large room, Lynx rushed forward, in a serpentine fashion across the center of the room, intent on taking down the woman before she could deal any form of massive damage that might compromise his mission. As he appeared on the woman's left, he launched the kunai at her throat, overloading the chakra in his feet to launch him over her in a twisting half-flip, forming the seals for, and calling out a shuriken Kage Bunshin no jutsu as he did so, his singular kunai changing into over 30 as he landed on the far side of the redhead, a Fuuma shuriken already in hand and flying towards her. The redhead, focused intently on dodging the multitude of kunai that had quickly come to rain on her from one side, nearly missed the large windmill shuriken that would have caught her square in the shoulder blades had she not thrown herself forwards into a shoulder roll at nearly the last second, before widening her eyes in abject anger, and shock as the bladed weapon curved back towards her, causing her to leap to the side to avoid being split in two. Unfortunately, as it passed her, she cursed once more as she saw the attached smoke bomb, which promptly exploded, covering the room in a thick mask of black smoke. Lynx smiled grimly to himself as he moved seamlessly through the room, noting with satisfaction as the other members of his team passed through the room, getting by as he continued to deal with his lone opponent. He sighed to himself as he created more Kage Bunshin, sending them out in multiple directions, their instructions already ingrained in their minds as he moved towards the woman who had by now regained her footing and was cursing him with a mouth that would make a sailor blush. Had he not been under strict orders to take as many alive as he was able, this woman would have already been eliminated. He was a sharp and precise blade, and mistakes were not tolerated, though, so he stayed his hand, instead ushering forth a small wind jutsu that cleared the smoke, allowing the woman to focus on him once again. "All right, you son of a bitch, now you've really pissed me off." The redhead glowered, while Lynx merely tilted his head to the side before vanishing in a shunshin, appearing in front of the young woman who he had gauged to be at about a high chunin level. The woman's face contorted into one of shock, yet again, a look that the masked ANBU operative had begun to think was quite befitting of her. As before she knew what had happened, his right arm had flown up, a small, concentrated racing gun forming in the small of his hand before he slammed it into the flute she had been constantly attempting to raise to her lips. The three members of the raid force knelt in front of their Hokage, all of their heads bowed out of their complete respect for their leader. The old Hokage had had them there for several minutes, simply looking through the folder that had been presented to him, which encompassed all of the actions the team had taken while they were on assignment. If he was being honest with himself, the old man was pleased, quite pleased with how things had gone, for it was on raids like these where things could very quickly go sideways, and it wasn't unheard of for entire teams of agents to fall in their pursuit. However, this particular mission had gone splendidly, and had almost no problems, even ending in the capture of one of Orochimaru's personal guards, if the girl's ramblings were to be believed. He made a mental note to seek out Ibiki later on and see what he had gleaned from the woman, who he was currently working over and interrogating right now. Yes, overall he was quite pleased, as even though he had given operational command to a less senior agent, the lieutenant had performed remarkably well under the circumstances, leading his team with precision and professionalism. The old Hokage turned around slowly, before raising his head to let it rest in the cradle created by his two hands under his chin, speaking softly, but with nothing less than the absolute authority that belonged to his position. "Tiger, you are dismissed. Inform Cat that she may enter on your way out. Lynx, Boar, stand and take your positions at the side." With a clipped and gruff Hokage-sama, both men moved out of the way as Cat entered the room following Tiger's departure. Cat moved with a purpose in the Hokage's office, standing strong and tall with every bit of poise and prestige her rank and status carried. She moved to stand dead center at the Hokage's desk, saluting, before standing off to the side of the desk, falling into a modified stance on the position of attention before addressing Lynx, who had come to attention himself up the entry of his captain. "Suteichu, Lynx. You stand here today not only to be recognized by your servitude to Konohagakure, but to be officially recognized in your new title, front and center." At this, Lynx moved to the middle of the room, still not quite comprehending what was happening. He had known that his captain had been on her way out of the ANBU Corps, but he was blissfully unaware that her chosen replacement was him. As he moved to the center of the room and knelt in front of his captain, he was still slightly bewildered as Cat resumed speaking. "Borteichu, do you vouch for the fidelity and abilities of Lynx, giving your blood-bound word that he is not only qualified, but justly represented for the position of Teichu?" Stepping forward, the large, burly man raised his palm to his chest in a stone fist, speaking gruffly, yet no less solemn. "I, Boar, having seen firsthand the fidelity and abilities of Lynx, do recommended him for Teichu in the ANBU Corps, to rank as such and command his division." Having said his part, Boar stepped back, returning to attention, as the Hokage continued to look on silently, appraising the ceremony with an expert eye. As Cat stepped forward once again, this time with her right hand glowing a dull crimson color, the flames dancing upon her fingertips. "Do you, Lynx, swear to uphold the ideals and values of the ANBU, leading this division with distinction and loyalty, accepting nothing but victory, choosing to tread in the shadows that even the ANBU themselves fear to walk, leading as an impenetrable force and an unstoppable barrier?" Lynx, hearing his verbal que, remained kneeling, but raised his masked head, making eye contact with his captain of over 2 years as he spoke. "Upon my honor as a defender of the Leaf, I pledge my heart and soul in their defense." He finished, standing to his full height and performing a crisp right face, revealing his left shoulder to his captain, his ANBU tattoo on full display. Cat stepped forward, before bringing her flame-coated hand to the blonde's shoulder, wincing behind her mask at the sound and sensation of burning flesh, as all the members of the room watched on, as Lynx's ANBU tattoo changed from that of a basic recruit to that of a captain, the scarring flesh a testament to his will and dedication. All 3 members of the ANBU Corps faced towards their Hokage, forming the hard clenched fist in their right hand before rising it to cover their hearts. The Hokage nodded once, simply and effectively dismissing his 2 ANBU captains and watching in satisfaction as they vanished in their own respective shunshuns before addressing the former Captain Cat. "Yugo, I think you made the right choice in your successor." He mused before turning to puff on his signature wooden pipe, watching out of the corner of his eye as the purple-haired woman slowly reached her hand up to the porcelain mask that had been her face for the last several years, removing it and placing it on the Hawkage desk, allowing a small, wry smile to grace her features. "Yes, Hawkage-sama, I believe he will do just fine." The blonde-haired man walked through the streets of Konoha, dressed in what used to be his usual ninja garb. It felt almost alien to him now, after having worn the uniform of the Black Ops Division for over 3 years. It was odd, he thought to himself as he trudged along one of the many side streets of his village, that he had while he considered the village his home. He had spent most of his life away from it, from his early life training with the Toda sage, Jirya, to even his time spent in ANBU, when he was often gone on missions. Yet he considered the village his home, though he was rarely there. He mused that his view would likely change once he eventually leave the Corps, but that wasn't likely to be any time soon, if he had his way. He genuinely enjoyed being in ANBU, and upon his promotion to captain, he had begun to appreciate it even more. It was actually in part because of his association with the program that he was able to do what he had planned today. Yes, today he was on a mission, though it was more of an off-the-record type deal. He mused to himself as he walked towards Training Ground 44, aptly nicknamed the Forest of Death by its denizens and more especially by the woman who had made the training grounds her home. He had no doubt that seeing Anko again for the first time in several years would turn out to be confrontational, but he figured he could quell her anger rather quickly with his reason for being there. Over the last few months, the young blonde man had become a true master of Fuinjutsu, reaching heights in the lost art that even the renowned seal master Jirya couldn't hope to achieve in this lifetime. It was during his studies, and while looking over various recovered notebooks from several of Orochimaru's bases, that he had finally figured out the way to relieve Konoha's own resident snake mistress of her curse mark. He had even done an experiment of his own, testing his theory and method by removing the curse mark of the sound Kunoichi, Teuya, who he had captured nearly a year ago during one of his final tests to become a captain. It had been an ordeal, and the woman had been less than cooperative, especially after she realized just who in fact he was, but nevertheless, he had managed to remove the cured mark from her body. This had all been about a month ago. He would have gone and met with his old sensei sooner, but he wanted to be sure that there would be no negative lasting effects from the forced removal of something that had been a part of the Kunoichi for so many years. As stone-hearted as he had become, one had to be if they were going to survive in the ANBU. He still had a soft spot for Anko, as she was one of the first friends he had ever made in Konoha who had made time for him, instead of the shunning he had been used to when he was younger. Lynx, no Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto, he reminded himself, was pulled out of his thoughts by the kunai that sailed past his cheek, slicing it open as the purple-haired Kunoichi in question appeared behind him, holding him close to her with her offending knife pointed at his throat. Well, look who finally decides to come say hello after all these years, and after all I did for you too. Anko mock pouted, releasing the blonde from her grasp as she brought her hand up to her forehead, acting in mock hurt at the situation. Naruto grinned. It had been a while since he had seen his old sensei, and he had to say, he missed her antics. That was part of the whole reason he was doing this in the first place. He could have simply taught one of the more adept at Fuinjutsu members of his division and sent them in his place, but Anko was important to him, and he absolutely wanted to be sure that nothing went awry. Hey Anko, long time no see. He laughed lightheartedly at the older woman still acting out how hurt she was at his lack of contact, but he knew that she was aware of the constraints of being in the ANBU Corps, so he didn't even bother to explain it. He was always in favor of the direct approach anyways. So, he said the one thing that any girl wants to hear, that is, as long as the girl happened to have a cursed seal on the side of her neck that she wanted to desperately be rid of for the last several years. I figured out how to remove the curse seal. Later on, Naruto would wish he had brought a camera with him, for the look that the snake mistress gave him was priceless. All noise seemed to stop in the small clearing that they were in, as Anko immediately ceased her eccentric motions, stopping mid-step to stare at the younger blonde. She walked up to him, slowly and deliberately, stopping only when the two were face to face, her face searching his for any sign of ill intent before asking slowly, "Really?" "Really?" Naruto opened the door, and before he even had to say anything, Anko walked inside and looked around, taking stock of her surroundings. The room she and the blonde were in was plain, to say the least. It was a simple square room, with a light fixture in the center ceiling and no windows or even any furniture present. As the perplete looked over her shoulder at her old student closing the door, she was slightly startled to see that it fit seamlessly into the wall, giving the illusion that the room had no exit. However, the room wasn't dreary or anything like one might expect, actually being a nice warm temperature, and had it been furnished, it could even have been cozy. All right, here we go. Anko. Naruto started looking away from her, and though he tried to hide it, she was able to make out the blush that was forming on his face quite easily. I need you to take your shirt off. I need the room to write out everything. The blonde finished, looking up at her somewhat sheepishly as Anko merely gave a small grin, before shrugging off her signature trench coat, before bringing her hands low and grabbing the hem of her fishnet shirt, pulling it up and over her head, exposing her very sizable bust to Naruto, who had the decency to try and look away, though it was more of an honorable effort than nothing else. Before long, all the seals had been completed, and after laying out a nearby scroll, the young ANBU captain was ready to begin, and did so in earnest after a small warning and apology to Anko. He raised his hand over her curse seal, and briefly his hand flashed a dark blue, the flames dancing along his fingertips colliding into a bright yellow as he grabbed the air over her seal akin to grabbing a doorknob, turning it as if to open. This is when things became difficult, for as the seal was opened, it began to fight back, and the dark whispers of Orochimaru himself filled the room, as Anko began to convulse in pain from the experience. Doing his best to ignore her, Naruto began channeling his own chakra into the seal, boosting the already overpowering matrix that cascaded all around the floor of the room. Soon, there was a dark flash of light, and then an orange energy pierced the skin on Anko's shoulder, flowing out of the center of the seal and floating in the air, before Naruto was able to bring his other hand over, swiftly writing out the kanji to several more seals in the air with a chakra lace's finger, his words and characters lingering for a small second in the air before vanishing. After he finished writing out all of the seals in the air, the energy itself began to slowly seep across the room and flow into the scroll that had been laid out, sealing its vile power away. This process repeated for around 4 hours, long after which Anko had passed out from the pain, but eventually all of the orange energy that had been forcefully implanted into the snake summoner had been extracted and sealed into the scroll. Naruto, after finishing the sealing and checking the status of the older Kunoichi and verifying that not only was she okay, but that the seal itself had vanished, turned to the scroll containing the essence of Orochimaru, and without a second thought, burnt it to dust with a small katen jutsu. Looking back to Anko, he quickly redressed her, but not before taking a second to appreciate her figure. He then lifted her into his arms, bridal style, and through deft use Shunshin arrived at his house, walking up to his large bed, gently laying Anko upon it before he walked back down the stairs, barely making it to the couch before passing out himself. Removing those damn seals was taxing. Naruto awoke from his dreams with a start. Something was off about where he was. Opening his eyes, he glanced around his room, but was unable to discern anything out of the ordinary about his bedroom. So he went to sit up, but was stopped by the small mumble that he heard slightly to his left, and the weight on his chest, and that's when it came back to him. The young Uzumaki heir walked upstairs to check on the newest addition to his house, opening the door to his bedroom and finding Anko looking at herself in the mirror, which stopped him in his tracks, his reason for walking up the stairs completely forgotten. It wasn't that Anko was looking in the mirror that caught him off guard. It was that she wasn't wearing a shirt and was facing him with her head turned over her shoulder, examining the small patch of skin on her neck where her curse seal used to sit. Now, though, it was blank, and the only evidence that it was ever there was the slightly lighter patch of skin that would soon fade into the same color the rest of her skin was. To say Anko was ecstatic was an understatement. Gone were the constant voices in her head. Gone were the random spasms of pain that would hit her at random times. They were all gone. She could finally think clearly again, and there was only one person to thank for that, one person who, if by the awkward silence that filled the room, was in the same place as her, and privately, too. The snake mistress, for all her forethought in her moment of elation, could only think of one way to thank him. "Good morning, hero," she greeted softly into his ear as she pushed him back onto the bed, starting to notice the slightly more primal look in Naruto's eyes as he visibly struggled not to give in to his inhibitions. She'd break him of that before long. Naruto was pulled from his thoughts on the night before by the purple-haired Jounin that was laying across his chest, lifting her head to give him a sly grin, before she leaned up and gave him a small kiss on the cheek. "Well, good morning again, Mr. Hero." Anko teased at him as she softly raked her fingers across the man's toned chest, And how did you like your reward for a job well done? She asked with a laugh. The blonde-haired Jinchuriki had the decency to scratch the back of his head in mock embarrassment, trying not to show just how much he had enjoyed it last night. Chuckling, Naruto gazed down at the woman sharing his bed before responding. I had a good time, Anko. He paused, trying to choose his next words carefully before deciding against it and going for a direct approach like he usually did. Anko, I'm not trying to ditch out on you, but I have to get to headquarters today. I spent a lot of time working on the removal of the seal, and I have to report to the Hawkage that it was a success. I don't have time to play games this morning. He managed to get out, keeping his cool despite the very gorgeous and very naked Kunoichi curled around him. He moved to get out of the bed, but was stopped when he felt Anko's delicate fingers wrap around his length, below the covers. Snapping his head over to her, he could only close his eyes and enjoy the sensations he was receiving under the snake mistress's expert touch on his manhood. Oh, really? Because it looks to me like this guy doesn't really want to leave all that bad. Anko trailed off, watching the blonde's face contort in pleasure as her hand masterfully stroked him. It wasn't long before Naruto let out a low, almost primal growl before rolling over on top of Anko, beginning ministrations of his own. He supposed he could be a few minutes late. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share, and do comments.